She was standing in a cafeteria line holding a food tray when he shoved her, hard, between the shoulder blades, in front of 80 witnesses. Her drink lifted off the tray. The room went quiet. Everyone expected her to fall. She didn't. What happened next took less than 2 seconds and dismantled everything Staff Sergeant Brock Mercer had spent 6 years building. Because the woman he just put his hands on had spent the last 36 hours single-handedly preventing a military catastrophe that would have paralyzed an entire nation. Nobody in that room knew it yet, but they were about to find out. If this story finds you, wherever you are in the world, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Now let's begin. The rain had been coming down since early morning. Not a dramatic storm, just that flat, indifferent kind of rain that soaks into everything without making much noise about it. The kind that doesn't care whether you have somewhere to be. Fort Caldwell's outer grounds had turned into a gray smear of wet concrete and mud-soaked gravel, the kind of afternoon that made the fluorescent glow of the operations complex feel warmer than it actually was. Building 7. The administrative and support wing of the Caldwell Joint Operations Command was shaped like a long rectangle with a cafeteria at one end and a maze of offices and secure briefing rooms at the other. Between them ran a central corridor wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass, though vehicles never used it. It was a corridor for people carrying things, document folders, radio equipment, boxes of equipment that never quite got labeled properly. The kind of hallway that always smelled faintly of burnt coffee and printer ink. At 13:47 hours on a Tuesday, the cafeteria was running at about 2/3 capacity. This was the mid-afternoon lull, too late for the lunch rush, too early for dinner prep. The soldiers eating now were the ones who'd pulled overnight rotations and were only now seeing their first full meal of the day, or the administrative staff who'd finally broken free of their desks, or the maintenance crews still in their gray coveralls with their names stitched above the breast pocket in faded thread. Nobody glamorous. Nobody important. Just people trying to eat without it becoming a whole thing. The food line stretched along the left wall. A stainless steel counter with heat lamps above it that did more for morale than for the food itself. Salisbury steak. Green beans that had seen better days. A bin of dinner rolls that had clearly been baked earlier in the week. 2 large coffee urns at the end, one labeled regular, the other labeled dark roast, though both tasted more or less the same. She was third from the end of the line. Nobody had noticed her come in. That wasn't unusual in itself. The cafeteria doors opened and closed constantly, and people moved in and out with the automatic indifference of a system functioning as designed. But if you'd been paying attention to the room before she entered and then looked again after, you might have registered a faint shift, the way a room sometimes changes when something off-register enters it. Nothing you could name, just a subtle recalibration, like a compass needle making a small, involuntary correction. She was wearing a faded gray jacket. Not military issue. Not civilian professional either. Something in between, the kind of garment you'd find in the back of a gear closet. Washed so many times, the original color had become a matter of interpretation. Dark cargo pants, boots that were worn in rather than worn out. No rank, no badge clipped to her collar, no lanyard with a Caldwell ID swinging from her neck. Her hair was pulled back with no particular care, just out of the way. She was maybe 35, maybe 40. It was hard to tell, and the difficulty wasn't about ambiguity in the conventional sense. It was more that her face seemed to resist casual reading. There was a thin scar that ran at an angle across her left cheekbone, starting just below the outer corner of her eye and ending near the jawline. Old, fully healed, the kind of scar that had stopped being something she thought about a long time ago. She stood completely still in the line. Not the stillness of someone bored or impatient or checking their phone, something different. She wasn't looking at the food. She wasn't looking at the people around her. Her eyes were tracking the room with the slow, methodical patience of someone running a background process, cataloging exits, clocking personnel, noting the position of the 2 MPs standing near the far door who were too deep in conversation to be doing their actual jobs. She wasn't doing any of this consciously. It was just what her nervous system did when it was left to its own devices. She picked up a tray. She moved forward 1 step when the line moved. That was all. Staff Sergeant Brock Mercer had been at Caldwell for 6 years, which was long enough to believe the place belonged to him in some fundamental, non-negotiable way. He was 32. He was big. Not bodybuilder big, but the kind of functional mass that came from years of PT and the occasional late-night session in the base gym when sleep wasn't cooperating. He had a square jaw and a close-cropped fade, and a way of entering a room that made everyone in it do a small, involuntary recalculation of the social order. He knew about this effect. He cultivated it. 6 years is a long time in one posting. Long enough to accumulate things. Junior soldiers who owed you favors. NCOs who'd rather not deal with the paperwork that came from crossing you. A reputation that preceded you into rooms you hadn't entered yet. Brock had all of these. He wore them like equipment. Not armor exactly, more like an external frame that gave him shape and purpose. The 4 soldiers with him now had been following him around for the better part of the afternoon, pulled along by the gravitational field of his confidence. Privates Nolan and Reyes, both 19, both knew enough to Caldwell that they were still learning which battles were winnable. Corporal Denny, who had been at Caldwell for 2 years and who had long since decided that proximity to Mercer was the path of least friction. And Specialist Walsh, who was smarter than the rest of them and knew it, and had decided that knowing it was enough. They came through the cafeteria doors talking, not about anything important, a pickup football game that had gone badly, a sergeant who'd handed out extra duty for something that wasn't anyone's fault, the usual texture of base life. Brock spotted her immediately, not because she stood out, because she didn't. There was something about the quality of her stillness that caught his eye in the way that absence catches the eye. A silence in the noise, a gap in the pattern. She was just standing there, holding a tray with 2 hands, not interacting with anyone, not performing the small social negotiations that cafeteria lines usually produced. He had a rule he'd never articulated but always followed. Nobody got to be in a room without belonging to the social order of that room. That was how rooms worked. That was how authority worked. You either had a place in the hierarchy or someone assigned you one. He walked toward her with his tray. Behind him, Nolan and Reyes exchanged a look. Walsh watched with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to express opinions in advance. Brock stopped 2 feet behind her. He didn't say anything right away. He just existed loudly, taking up space, making his presence felt the way a weather system makes its presence felt before the actual rain arrives. The woman didn't turn around. Brock looked at his soldiers, raised an eyebrow. The universal language of watch this. Hey. He said it to the back of her head. Casual, almost bored. Contractor? She didn't respond. I'm talking to you. Still casual, but with an edge underneath now, the kind of edge that had teeth. The woman in the gray jacket moved forward 1 step as the line advanced. She picked up a bread roll, examined it with the focused dispassion of someone who had developed personal standards about bread. Brock stepped closer. You don't have an ID on you, he said. It wasn't a question. Base policy, you're supposed to have your credentials visible. He paused. So where's your badge? She turned her head slightly, not all the way toward him, just enough to indicate she'd heard him. Credentials are on file, she said. Her voice was quiet and even. No particular accent. The kind of voice that had been drained of regional markers by time and distance and the constant relocating that certain kinds of work required. Processed this morning, guest access. Building 7 through 22. That's not what I asked. She turned back to the line. Brock felt something shift in him, a tightening, a kind of reflexive irritation at being dismissed that was physical before it was anything else. He was aware that his soldiers were watching. He was aware that 3 people at the nearest table had turned to look. He was aware of all of this in the way that a performer is aware of an audience, not distracted by it, but sharpened. You know what your problem is, he said, keeping his voice conversational, loud enough to carry. You walk in here like nobody can see you, like none of this applies to you. He gestured at the room. But this is my base, and on my base, people show ID. The woman set her bread roll on her tray. Her hands didn't rush. She was moving at exactly the speed she always moved, and no one in the room had yet realized what that meant. I'm not going to show you my ID, she said. The room had been gradually quieting. Not dramatically, just the slow drop in ambient noise that happens when people decide that paying attention is more interesting than their conversation. Brock smiled. It wasn't a good smile. No? No. He looked back at Denny and Walsh. The smile widened. Then he shoved her. Both palms, flat against the space between her shoulder blades. Hard. The kind of shove that was designed to send someone stumbling forward, arms windmilling, tray clattering to the ground, dignity dissolving in a mess of green beans and spilled coffee. He was already calculating the aftermath, the way she'd scramble to recover, the laughter, the recovery of the social moment. He had done versions of this before. Not often, he wasn't reckless, but often enough to know how they went. This one went differently. What happened next lasted less than 2 seconds, but it took most of the people in the room considerably longer than that to process it. The shove landed clean. There was force behind it. Force enough that the tray pitched forward, and the cup on the tray, plastic, half filled with water, lifted from the tray surface on a trajectory that was going to end badly. Then her right hand moved, not up toward the cup in the obvious reaching way. The motion was sideways first, angled, intercepting the cup's path at a point in space that shouldn't have been calculable in the time available. Her wrist rotated. The cup landed in her palm. The tray came level. Her weight had shifted, barely, almost invisibly, redistributing just enough to absorb the forward momentum without transferring it to her feet. Not a drop spilled. Silence. The kind of silence that isn't just the absence of noise, but the presence of something else. Everyone in the cafeteria had gone still. The MPs near the far door had stopped talking. The kitchen staff had paused with serving spoons in their hands. The woman stood where she had been standing. She looked at the cup in her hand. She set it back on the tray. Then slowly, she turned her head toward Brock. He was still in the forward position from the shove. His palms were still slightly extended. He was smiling, but the smile had lost its architecture. It was just a shape now, a reflex trying to hold a form that the muscles underneath were no longer supporting. Her eyes were pale, gray or green depending on the light. They were the kind of eyes that had looked at a great many things and had not been damaged by any of them. Not hardened, exactly, but reorganized. Recalibrated around a different set of reference points than most people carried. The scar on her cheekbone caught the fluorescent light. She looked at him for exactly 4 seconds. Nobody in the room moved. "The system is malfunctioning," she said. Her voice was the same quiet, even register it had been before. No anger, no accusation, no performance of injury or offense. She might have been reading a status report. Then she turned back to the line. Private Reyes, who would think about this moment for years, later said that the worst part wasn't what she did, it was what she didn't do. She didn't make him explain himself. She didn't demand an apology. She didn't call for a superior or reach for authority. She simply removed him from the relevant category. As if his action had been a minor environmental irregularity. A flickering light. A door that stuck. Brock stood there. For 6 years he had held the room. He had known how to hold the room. Had refined the skill to the point where it was unconscious, automatic. The room was something you occupied through force of presence and the willingness to fill space that others left empty. Standing there with his hands still extended, he felt the room leave him. It didn't happen with drama. It happened the way authority always really leaves. Not seized, just quietly withdrawn. The people who had been watching turned back to their food. The conversation resumed, but lower, with a different quality, as if the register of the room had changed. Walsh, who was smarter than the rest of them and knew it, quietly picked up his tray and moved to a table near the windows. Brock didn't move. The woman was reaching for the coffee urn. The sound came from the corridor first, polished soles on composite flooring, not the flat tread of work boots, but the sharp, deliberate cadence of dress shoes moving at a pace that expected the hallway to clear. 2 aides came through the cafeteria doors first, scanning the room automatically in the way that people who have spent years managing the movement of important people scan rooms, calculating lines of sight, identifying personnel, registering anomalies. Then Brigadier General Victor Hale walked in. He was 53, gray at the temples, with the kind of frame that said he had been exceptionally fit in his 30s and had maintained roughly 80% of that through discipline and stubbornness. His service dress was immaculate, not because he was vain about it, because he had spent enough time in situations where the state of your uniform was the only variable you could control, and the habit had solidified into character. The cafeteria reacted the way rooms always reacted to general officers. A half-second of uncertainty, then the scraping of chairs as people rose, then the settling when Hale raised one hand briefly. At ease, don't make this a whole thing. He walked directly across the cafeteria. He didn't look at Brock. He didn't look at the kitchen staff. He didn't look at the MPs near the door, who were now standing very straight and wishing they'd been paying more attention. He looked at the woman in the gray jacket who was pouring herself a cup of coffee. He stopped one step behind her. Chief Voss. She took one more second with the coffee, adding exactly the amount she wanted, pressing the lever down deliberately, not rushing because a general was behind her. Then she turned. "General? I've been looking for you," Hale said. "I know." A pause. "I needed to eat." Something crossed Hale's face. Not quite a smile, but the compressed precursor to one. The kind that you only produce when something strikes you as genuinely absurd and you're in a context where laughing out loud would be inappropriate. "Fair enough," he said. The two aides had positioned themselves at a respectful distance, which was how generals' aides communicated this conversation is private, even though it's happening in front of 80 people. Brock Mercer had not moved. He was still standing in the middle of the cafeteria, tray in his hands, working through the recalculation that was happening in real time. A general had walked past him, had walked past his soldiers, past the table where Denny was staring at his food, past Walsh, who was studying the window with great interest, and had walked directly to the woman Brock had just shoved. "I need to brief you," Hale said. "The NSA liaison is running out of patience. The Pentagon's running out of patience. Everyone is running out of patience. Tell them to get in line." She said it without inflection. "The problem doesn't care about their patience." "The problem," Hale said carefully, "is that the problem is still no." She looked up at him. "It's not." She picked up her tray. "It was resolved at 11:14 this morning. I sent the termination report to your secure channel at 11:40. The documentation will take another 48 hours, but the threat vector is closed. All of it." Hale went very still. "All of it," he repeated. "All of it." The general exhaled through his nose. A single controlled breath, the kind that precedes either a significant decision or the release of a significant weight. "The communications blackout," he said. "The relay compromise. Fixed. Patched. The entry point was a legacy authentication protocol in the SATCOM handshake layer that hadn't been updated in 11 years. I found it at hour 22. Spent the next 14 hours closing everything it had touched." She paused. "It had touched a lot." Hale was quiet for a moment. Around them, the cafeteria had gone almost completely silent. Not the dramatic silence of a confrontation, but the deeper silence of a room full of people trying to understand something just out of reach. 36 hours, Hale said, give or take. "You've been awake for 36 hours. She picked up her bread roll. Took a bite. 38, she said, chewing. "I don't count the first two. I was just reading." Hale looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was difficult to categorize. The expression of a man who had been in the military for 30 years and believed he had developed a calibrated understanding of human capability and was being regularly revised on this point by the person standing in front of him. Then he turned. Not to his aides, not to the room in general. He turned to face the cafeteria, and the cafeteria understood, instinctively and without requiring it to be explained, that something was about to be said that would not be said again. "Most of you don't have clearance for what I'm about to tell you," he said, his voice carried without effort. "And most of what I'm about to tell you will be classified within the hour." He paused. "But I want there to be no ambiguity in this room about who is standing at that counter." The kitchen staff had put down their utensils. Private Reyes had stopped breathing. Brock Mercer stood exactly where he had been standing, with the tray in his hands, watching a general officer command a cafeteria. "For the last 72 hours, Hale said, the communications infrastructure supporting joint military operations across 4 theaters has been under active cyber attack. Not a probe, not a test, a coordinated, sophisticated assault on the backbone of this country's operational nervous system. We lost relay integrity. We lost encrypted channel stability. We came within," he paused for a fraction of a second, "very close to losing things I am not at liberty to specify." He let that sit. 347 analysts, engineers, and specialists across 6 agencies worked on this problem. The combined resources of NSA, Cyber Command, DARPA, and 3 private defense contractors were brought in. None of them closed it. The room was utterly silent. The woman at that counter, Hale said, worked alone. She used a single terminal, a clean network partition, and whatever she had in her head. She slept for a total of 0 hours. She ate. He glanced at her tray. Apparently not enough. Another compressed non-smile. And at 11:14 this morning, she terminated the threat. He turned back to the cafeteria. Her name is Chief Specialist Elena Voss. She holds a classification level most of you will never have the clearance to know the name of. In the community that knows she exists at all, she is referred to by a different name. He paused once more. The Phantom. The word landed in the silence of the room like a stone dropping into still water. Brock Mercer felt the tray in his hands. He felt how heavy it was, how ordinary, how completely, catastrophically inadequate as an object to be holding at this precise moment in this room. Private Nolan made a sound that was not quite a word. Walsh, at his table by the windows, had turned around. He was looking at Brock with an expression that was not unkind exactly, but was very clear. The expression of someone watching a consequence materialize in real time. Elena Voss had not turned around during any of this. She was eating her green beans. Hale's aide, a lean captain named Osterfeld, who had been with the general for 2 years and had developed a finely tuned sense for when to intervene in situations, leaned slightly forward. "Sir," Osterfeld said quietly, "there was an incident, in the line, before you arrived." Hale turned to look at him. Osterfeld's eyes moved, carefully, deliberately, toward Brock. The general followed the look. Brock felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with temperature. Hale looked at him for a long moment. There was nothing theatrical in the look. No performance of authority, no staged intimidation. It was simply the look of a man assembling information and reaching a conclusion, and the conclusion was visible in his face the moment it formed. "Staff Sergeant," Hale said. Brock straightened. Old reflex. Inescapable. "Sir? Is there something you'd like to say?" The cafeteria was waiting, not eagerly, not in the way of people hoping to see someone humiliated, but with the focused, almost sorrowful attention of people witnessing something inevitable. Brock opened his mouth. He had 6 years of practiced confidence, 6 years of knowing how to hold a room, 6 years of building something that had felt, until approximately 8 minutes ago, like genuine strength. "I didn't know who she was," he said. It came out smaller than he intended. Hale looked at him. "No," the general said quietly. That was exactly the problem. He let that breathe for a moment. "You didn't know who she was, and because you didn't know who she was, you decided she was someone you could put your hands on." He paused. "In my cafeteria, on my base, in front of my soldiers." The word "my" landed each time with the quiet force of something structural. "Sergeant." "Sir." "You'll report to Sergeant Major Crandall at 0700 tomorrow. You'll bring the JAG forms with you. You'll fill them out honestly." Hale's voice had not risen, had not needed to. "And you will spend the next several weeks thinking very carefully about the difference between confidence and arrogance, because right now I'm not certain you know what that difference is." Brock nodded. His throat was tight. "Sir." Hale held his gaze for one more second, then turned away. Not dismissively, just finished. The way you turn away from something when the necessary thing has been said and extending it further would serve no one. He walked to where Elena Voss was finishing her coffee. "When did you last sleep?" he asked. "I don't remember." "That's not a good sign." "I know." She set the cup down. "I need 4 hours and a clean debrief space. Then I can walk you through the documentation." 4 hours then. Osterfeld will get you a room." "I don't need a room. I'll sleep in the briefing annex." She picked up her tray. "There's less ambient noise." Hale watched her. "Is there anything you need?" She thought about it, genuinely considered the question rather than giving the automatic "no, sir, I'm fine" that the moment almost demanded. "The kid," she said. "There was a kid near the door when I came in. Maintenance crew. Couldn't have been more than 19. He dropped his tray when the sergeant—" She stopped. "Someone should check on him. He was embarrassed." Hale blinked. He had spent 30 years in the military, had commanded units in 3 different combat theaters, had sat across the table from people with more medals than he'd ever earned, and in all of that time he had rarely encountered anyone with the particular combination of qualities this woman carried. The absolute, almost clinical ability to function in conditions that broke other people, combined with a compass that kept orienting, without any apparent effort, toward whoever in the room was most overlooked. "I'll see to it," he said. She nodded. She carried her tray to the return window. She placed it precisely on the counter. And then Elena Voss walked out of the cafeteria, through the corridor that smelled of burnt coffee and printer ink, into the flat gray afternoon, still raining, still indifferent, and disappeared around a corner. The room let out a long collective breath. At the table near the window, Specialist Walsh sat very still with his hands flat on the table and his food untouched, staring at the door she had walked through. At the center of the cafeteria, Staff Sergeant Brock Mercer stood holding his tray. He stood there for a long time. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the way they always had, the way they always would. The kitchen staff resumed their work. Conversations came back online, quieter than before, with a different texture. The MPs near the far door were standing straight now, which was too late to matter, and they knew it. Private Reyes looked at the door Elena Voss had walked through. Then he looked at the spot on the floor where her cup had nearly fallen. Then he looked at Brock. "Sarge," he said carefully. Brock didn't respond. "Sarge, your food's getting cold." Brock set his tray down on the nearest empty table. He sat. He picked up his fork. He put it down again. 38 hours, she had said. She had been awake for 38 hours, fighting something invisible and enormous, something that had required the combined resources of 6 intelligence agencies and still hadn't yielded, until it yielded to her, alone, on a single terminal, in the same building where he had been picking up extra duty assignments and complaining about the football game and deciding that a woman with a gray jacket and no visible rank was someone who needed to be reminded of her place. He sat with that. The rain continued outside. It did not care. 3 tables away, at a round table near the wall, a young maintenance specialist named Private Garvey, 19 years old, 6 weeks at Caldwell, still mortified about the tray he'd dropped earlier when the shoving happened, was quietly finishing his dinner roll. One of General Hale's aides walked over and crouched down and said something quietly to him. Garvey looked up, looked confused, then nodded slowly. Whatever the aide said, Garvey seemed to hold it for a moment before he exhaled and sat a little straighter. Brock watched this happen. He didn't know what had been said. He didn't know what she had asked the general to do. He only knew that even walking out of the room, with 38 hours of no sleep and a country's worth of invisible work behind her, she had been thinking about the kid near the door. He picked up his fork again. He still didn't eat. Outside, a door opened and closed somewhere in the building. Down the corridor in the briefing annex with the lower ambient noise, Elena Voss pulled a chair away from a table, sat down, crossed her arms on the surface, rested her head on her arms, and within 40 seconds was asleep. The terminal beside her still showed the last line of code she'd written at 11:09 that morning. The threat was closed. The work was done. Nobody came to check on her for 4 hours, because the general had been very specific about that. In the cafeteria, the fluorescent lights buzzed. Brock Mercer sat. And 40 feet away at the far end of the corridor, Sergeant Major Crandall, who had said nothing, who had witnessed everything, who had served at Caldwell for 11 years and had seen a great many things come and go, pulled out a small notepad, wrote 3 words on it, tore out the page, and folded it into his breast pocket. He would read it again in the morning before Mercer came in with his JAG forms. The 3 words were, "Know the room." And somewhere in the building, a door that had been propped open against the rain finally swung shut on its own. The 4 hours passed the way time passes when something significant is waiting on the other side of it. Not slowly, not quickly, but with a kind of weighted inevitability, like a door that's been closing for a long time, finally settling into its frame. At 18:01 hours, Captain Osterfeld knocked twice on the briefing annex door, waited 3 seconds, and opened it. Elena Voss was already awake, not groggy, not disoriented, not doing the human thing of blinking at the light and needing a moment to locate herself in time and space. She was sitting upright in the chair, both hands flat on the table, eyes open, looking at the terminal beside her the way someone looks at a problem they left unfinished and have been thinking about even while unconscious. Osterfeld had seen a lot of things in 2 years with General Hale. He was not easily unsettled. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "the general is ready." "I know." She stood, rolled her neck once, left then right, with the mechanical efficiency of someone performing maintenance rather than stretching. "Is the debrief room configured?" "Yes, ma'am." "Room 14. Secure line to the Pentagon is standing by. NSA liaison is already impatient. His word was concerned. Same thing." She picked up a slim folder from the table. Not a thick document, not the kind of multi-tabbed briefing packet that analysts produced when they wanted to look thorough. 6 pages. Maybe 8. The kind of summary you wrote when you understood the problem well enough to reduce it to what mattered. "Let's go." Osterfeld fell in beside her as she walked. "Ma'am," he said after a moment. "Captain." "The Staff Sergeant. Mercer." He paused. "He's still in the cafeteria." She didn't slow down. "How long?" "Hour and 40 minutes." She said nothing. "He hasn't eaten," Osterfeld added, and then seemed to realize this was not relevant information and stopped offering it. They walked the corridor in silence. The rain had stopped at some point during the 4 hours, and the building had that particular quality of quiet that came after weather. A settling, like the structure itself was exhaling. Walk. Room 14 was at the end of the B-wing, behind a cipher-locked door, and a second door that was just a door but was the kind of door that communicated intention through its weight and its frame. Inside, a rectangular table, 8 chairs, a wall display currently showing a standby screen, and 2 people already seated who both looked up when Elena walked in with the expression of people who had been waiting longer than they wanted to and were not going to say so directly because the woman walking through the door had just done something that made complaint seem structurally inadequate. The NSA liaison was named Drexler. He was 51, with the particular bearing of someone who had spent decades operating at the intersection of bureaucracy and classified information, careful, contained, with a tendency to use the word framework in contexts where it didn't quite fit. He had driven 4 hours from his regional office at 600 that morning and had spent most of the day in a secure holding area being briefed on things he already mostly knew by people who seemed to find the briefing process its own reward. The other person was Colonel Adrienne Marsh, Caldwell's deputy installation commander. She was 47, tall, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses she only put on when she didn't want anyone to see her doing it. She had been at Caldwell for 3 years and had formed, in that time, a carefully maintained position of professional neutrality toward Elena Voss, which was to say, she respected the outcomes while remaining deeply uncomfortable with the process, and she was honest enough with herself to know that the discomfort was about control, and that the lack of control was entirely her own. General Hale was already standing when Elena entered. He didn't sit until she did, which was a courtesy so small it would have been invisible to most people in the room. Drexler noticed it. He filed it away. Elena sat, opened the folder, and looked at the wall display. "Give me the feed from Node 7, she said. Someone in the adjacent tech room, a specialist named Pack, who had been waiting with characteristic patience for something to do, pulled up the display. Data cascaded across the wall screen, network topology, authentication logs, timestamp sequences that meant nothing to Drexler, and everything to the people who'd spent the last 72 hours inside them. "All right," Elena said. "I'll walk you through it once. Ask questions at the end. If you interrupt, I'll lose the thread and we'll be here twice as long." Drexler opened his mouth. Hale looked at him. Drexler closed his mouth. Elena began. What followed was 40 minutes of the most compressed, efficient technical briefing anyone in Room 14 had ever witnessed. And Room 14 had hosted some thorough briefings. She didn't use jargon for its own sake. She didn't use simplifications that lost accuracy. She found the exact level of specificity that made each point land for every person in the room simultaneously, which was a skill most people spent careers trying to develop and never fully reached. The attack had started not with the systems everyone had been watching, but with a legacy authentication protocol in the satellite communications handshake layer. A component so old and so consistently overlooked that it hadn't appeared on any of the vulnerability assessment documents produced in the last 6 years. The attackers had been patient. They had used the protocol not as an entry point, but as a footprint, a way to exist in the network without triggering the monitoring systems that were watching for exactly the kind of activity that showed up on monitoring systems. They were invisible, she said, because they were operating below the threshold of what the monitoring was designed to see. Like, imagine you've built a fence to keep out people 6 feet tall. These people were 5'11". The monitoring systems were calibrated to existing threat profiles, Marsh said. It wasn't a question. To the last 3 years of existing threat profiles, the attack was built around the gaps in those profiles. She moved the display forward. Once I found the footprint, I had to work backward through 14 months of network activity to map everything it had touched. That took, she paused, seemed to do a quick internal calculation. 14 hours, give or take. 14 hours, Drexler repeated. For 14 months of network data. She looked at him. Yes. He wrote something down. The restoration process, Marsh said. The encrypted channel stability, restored in sequence. SATCOM first because that was the most critical operational dependency, then the relay integrity, then the authentication stack from the ground up. She flipped a page in the folder. The sequence matters. If you restore in the wrong order, you're essentially reopening the entry point while you're still cleaning it, which is what the 300 analysts were doing, Hale said quietly. A pause. I didn't say that, Elena said. No, Hale said. I did. Drexler looked between them. He had the expression of a man watching a conversation that was not quite the conversation on the surface. Chief Voss, he said carefully, the preliminary report indicates the threat vector is fully closed. We'll need the technical documentation for independent verification before we can— 48 hours, she said. I told the general this morning. 48 hours is what it takes. She looked at him directly, not aggressively, just with the flat, unornamented certainty of someone who has finished the work and is now in the part of the process that feels like explaining rain. The documentation is accurate. The verification will confirm it. If you want it faster, I can give you something faster that's less complete, and then you can spend the next week discovering why complete matters. Drexler held her gaze for a moment. Then he wrote something else down. There's one more thing, Elena said. She pulled a single sheet from the back of the folder and slid it across the table. Hale looked at it. His expression changed. Not dramatically, not in the performed way of someone registering information for an audience, just a quiet, specific shift in the muscles around his eyes. The origin, he said. Best assessment, 73% confidence. The remaining uncertainty is structural. The routing made definitive attribution mathematically difficult. But the behavioral signatures, the timing patterns, the specific components of the protocol exploit, she tapped the sheet. This wasn't random. This wasn't opportunistic. Someone built this for us specifically, and they built it over a long time. Marsh leaned forward to look at the sheet. She didn't say anything for a moment. This changes the classification of the event, she said. Yes. This means we're not looking at a general infrastructure attack. We're looking at targeted operational intelligence collection with a denial of service component built in as a contingency. Elena closed the folder. The blackout wasn't the goal. The blackout was the cover. The room was quiet. Outside, somewhere in the building, a phone rang twice and stopped. Drexler set down his pen. How long have you known this? He asked. Hour 26, she said. You've known for 12 hours. I've suspected for 12 hours. The confirmation came at hour 34. She looked at him. I didn't put it in the preliminary report because I didn't have enough confidence in the attribution. I'm telling you now because I do. Drexler looked at Hale. Hale looked at the sheet on the table. All right, the general said. This stays in this room until we have the documentation. Drexler, your people talk to nobody until we've run the secondary verification through NSA's own analysis team. Marsh, I want base security protocols at Condition 3 starting tonight. Yes, sir. And someone get Chief Voss a meal that isn't a dinner roll. A beat of silence. Then, from the adjacent tech room, Specialist Pack's voice came through the intercom with the careful neutrality of someone who had been listening to 4-star level security briefings while also noting that someone hadn't eaten. There's a sandwich situation available, ma'am. If that's fine, Elena said. Is it? The rest of that evening moved in the particular rhythm of institutional consequence. The careful, interlocking series of notifications and adjustments and quiet conversations behind closed doors that happened when something significant had occurred, and everyone with authority was attempting to manage the radius of its impact. Brock Mercer, who had finally left the cafeteria at 1922 hours, did not sleep well. He had gone back to his quarters in the NCO barracks at the east end of the compound, a single room he'd occupied for 4 years, furnished with the accumulated evidence of a life that had been organized around the base rather than around anything outside it. A wall of unit photos. A shelf with some awards he looked at less often than he used to. A whiteboard on the wall with the week's duty schedule. His own name at the top of the rotation because he had always put it at the top. He lay on his bunk with his boots off and the light on and stared at the ceiling. He was not a man who spent a great deal of time in internal examination. This was not self-criticism. It was just accurate. He had built his life around forward motion, around the physical and social reality of the world in front of him, and he was good at that world. He knew how it worked. He knew where he stood in it, or he had thought he knew. The thing about the cafeteria, the thing that was keeping him awake with his eyes on a ceiling that had nothing to offer, was not the public aspect of it. It was not the general, or the soldiers, or the way the room had shifted. Those things were bad, and he was under no illusions about what they meant for the next several weeks of his professional life, but they were manageable. Consequences were manageable. He had managed consequences before. What was not manageable, what was in fact resistant to every framework he tried to apply to it, was the memory of those 4 seconds. She had turned and looked at him, and the look had not been angry, which he could have worked with. It had not been frightened, which would have been worse in a different way. It had not been disappointed or contemptuous or performing any of the reactions that would have located him clearly in her frame of reference. The look had been evaluative, briefly, efficiently evaluative, like someone checking a calculation, and then it had moved on. That was what he couldn't get past. Not that he'd been wrong, not that he'd been publicly corrected, but that to her the incident had been so minor, so operationally irrelevant, that it hadn't warranted a sustained response. He had done something that he had always understood as a demonstration of authority, and it had been received as an environmental glitch. The system is malfunctioning. He turned onto his side and looked at the whiteboard. His name at the top of the duty rotation. He thought about the way the general had saluted her. Not out of protocol. Hale had said that himself. Out of respect. He thought about what it took to earn a salute from a 4-star general who had 3 decades of uniform behind him and who treated the gesture as a currency to be spent carefully. He thought about 38 hours without sleep, fighting something invisible, alone. He turned the light off at 2300 hours. He did not sleep for a long time after that. The next morning arrived cold and clear, the rain having given way to the kind of hard-edged autumn light that made the base look more austere than it actually was. All concrete edges and bare ground and flagpoles that moved in the wind with the hollow sound of cable against metal. Elena Voss emerged from the briefing annex at 0611. She had technically slept, the second time after the debrief, in an actual quarters room that Osterfeld had insisted on, with the kind of insistence that communicated this is from the general and is not optional. 4 more hours. A shower. Clean clothes from a bag she apparently traveled with everywhere, because the contents were the same kind of functional, nondescript as the gray jacket. Nothing branded, nothing identifiable, nothing that announced anything about the person inside them. She walked to the mess hall, the main one, not the cafeteria in Building 7, and got coffee and eggs and sat alone at a table near the back wall. She ate quickly and without distraction, the way she did everything, not rudely, just efficiently. She had a notebook open beside her plate, and she wrote in it occasionally between bites. Not typed notes, actual handwritten ones, in a script so small and compressed it was essentially personal code. She was on her second coffee when Sergeant Major Crandall sat down across from her. She didn't look up immediately. "Sergeant Major," she said, finishing a note. "Chief Voss?" He set his own tray down. Coffee, toast, the kind of breakfast a man eats when he's been in the military long enough to stop having opinions about food. "Mind if I sit?" "Already sitting." "Fair point." He arranged his tray with the automatic precision of someone who'd been doing it for 25 years. Mercer comes in at 0700. I know. You got a preference for how that goes? She looked up at him then. Crandall was 57, built like someone who had once been very powerful and was now a more concentrated version of that. He had a face that had resolved all of its ambiguities years ago. Not hard, but settled. The kind of face that had seen too much to be surprised and had made peace with that. My preference is irrelevant, she said. I'm asking anyway. She looked at her coffee. He made a mistake. He didn't know who I was. He made the mistake because of who he thought I was, which is a different problem than the mistake itself. She paused. The mistake is fixable. The other thing is harder. Crandall nodded slowly. He's not a bad soldier. I didn't say he was. He's arrogant. Been arrogant since week 1. I've watched it calcify over 6 years into something that was starting to concern me before yesterday. Crandall turned his coffee cup in his hands. Yesterday didn't fix anything, but it broke something loose. Elena looked at him. You're telling me this because you could press harder than you will. Crandall held her gaze. You have the standing. You could end his career in this building before lunch. The paperwork would be clean. Nobody would fault you. She was quiet for a moment. But you won't, he said. It wasn't a question. No. Why? She picked up her pen, looked at it. Because ending his career doesn't fix the problem. And I'm not interested in punishing people. I'm interested in fixing problems. She set the pen down. If he's not a bad soldier, then something useful might still come out of this. That's a better outcome than the alternative. Crandall considered this for a long moment. You know, he said, I've been doing this for 25 years, and I can count on one hand the people I've met who actually think that way versus the people who say they think that way. She picked up her coffee. Finish your toast, Sergeant Major. He almost smiled. He didn't quite get there, but almost. At 06:58, Brock Mercer stood outside the Sergeant Major's office with his JAG forms in a folder and a night's worth of not sleeping behind his eyes. The hallway outside Crandall's office was the kind of hallway that had absorbed, over many years, the particular anxiety of people waiting for official conversations they did not want to have. The paint was institutional green. The floor was waxed composite tile. There was a fire safety poster on the wall that nobody had read in years, but nobody had taken down either. Brock had his dress uniform on. Pressed. Correct. It was the kind of thing you did automatically when you were going somewhere that mattered, regardless of whether you decided how you felt about the going. He heard voices inside the office. 2 people. Then the door opened. Crandall stepped out, looked at him, and stepped back inside without saying anything. The universal language of come in. Brock came in. The office was small and organized with the aggressive tidiness of someone who considered clutter a moral failing. 2 chairs in front of the desk, which Crandall was already behind. A filing cabinet with its drawers labeled in printed tape. A window that looked out at the east parking lot, which was currently occupied by a fuel truck and several vehicles that had seen better decades. Elena Voss was sitting in one of the chairs. Brock stopped. He had not expected this. He had expected Crandall. He had prepared, in the fragmented way of someone running the preparation in the back of their mind while the front of their mind did other things, for a conversation with Crandall. He had not prepared for this. She was looking at the window, not pointedly. She wasn't performing indifference. She was just looking at the parking lot in the way of someone who was present in a room without requiring the room to perform for her. Sit down, Sergeant, Crandall said. Brock sat. In the chair next to Elena Voss because there was no other chair. The folder with the JAG forms was in his lap. He was suddenly very aware of the folder. You've got the paperwork, Crandall said. Yes, Sergeant Major. Leave it on the desk. Brock set it on the desk. Nobody spoke for a moment. Outside, the fuel truck started its engine, a loud diesel complaint that rattled the window briefly and then settled into a rumble. Sergeant Mercer, Crandall said. Chief Voss is here because she requested to be. He let that land. You can say what you need to say. Brock looked at Elena. She turned from the window and looked back at him. Up close, in the sober morning light of a small office, she looked different than she had in the cafeteria. Not softer. That wasn't the word. More textured, maybe. The scar was more visible. There were shadows under her eyes that even sleep hadn't fully addressed. She looked like someone who was operating at roughly 90% capacity and had long since made peace with the fact that 90% was what she had, and it was enough. "I owe you an apology," Brock said. He had thought about how to say this, had revised it during the night, had landed on the simplest version because the simplest version was the one that didn't have any architecture built around avoiding accountability. "I put my hands on you," he said, "in a professional environment, in front of other soldiers. That was wrong, and it doesn't matter who you are. It would have been wrong regardless of who you are. I want you to know I understand that." Elena looked at him. The fluorescent lights hummed, just like they had in the cafeteria, just like they did everywhere on this base, a constant ambient note that nobody heard after the first week, and everybody heard in the moments when everything else went quiet. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he repeated. Not sure what to do with the simplicity of that. "The apology is noted." She paused. "I'm not going to tell you it's fine because it's not. And I'm not going to tell you it's the worst thing anyone has ever done to me because it's also not that." She held his gaze. "What I want to know is whether yesterday changed anything for you. Not about me specifically, about how you see the people in the rooms you walk into." Brock sat with that for a moment. "Yes," he said. "How?" The question landed harder than he expected. Not because it was aggressive. She asked it the same way she apparently did everything, with a kind of focused, patient directness that didn't leave room for the deflections he might normally have used. "I've been here 6 years," he said, "and I've spent most of that time building something, a reputation, an authority. And I think—" He stopped, started again. "I think I mistook the size of what I'd built for the size of what was actually there. The thing I built and the thing I thought I built weren't the same thing." She looked at him for a moment. "That's more honest than I expected," she said. "I've been awake for most of the night," he said. "When you're awake for most of the night, you run out of the energy it takes to say the version that sounds better." Something in her face shifted. Not dramatically, just a faint recalibration around the eyes. It wasn't warmth exactly, but it was the recognition that the thing in front of her was real. "I know something about that," she said quietly. Crandall, who had been watching this exchange with the focused attention of someone cataloging data for future use, picked up the JAG folder. "Right," he said. "Let's talk about what happens next." What happened next was laid out in the careful, specific language of military administrative consequence: modified duty status, a formal written reprimand, a mandatory command counseling session with the installation's behavioral review officer, a 90-day conduct review period during which Mercer's leadership roster would be temporarily suspended. Not career-ending, not designed to be, but significant enough to be structural rather than cosmetic. Brock accepted each item without objection. There was no point in objection, and he knew it. He signed where he was asked to sign and initialed where he was asked to initial. When it was done, Crandall clipped the forms. "You're dismissed," he said. "Report back to B Company at 1300. Modified duties will be communicated by noon." Brock stood. He looked at Elena. She was looking at the parking lot again. The fuel truck had gone. There was a corporal out there now, walking briskly through the cold morning light, with a radio on his hip, heading somewhere with the forward lean of someone who was late for whatever came next. "Chief Voss," Brock said. She turned. He didn't have anything prepared. He'd said the prepared thing. What was left was the unprepared thing, which was the thing that had been sitting at the back of his mind since 2,300 hours and hadn't resolved itself into language until this exact moment. "I've been here 6 years," he said, "and I didn't know your name. I didn't know what was happening in that building while I was here. I didn't—" He stopped. "I didn't know the shape of the things I didn't know. Does that make sense?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "That's the beginning." He nodded. He left. The door closed behind him with the solid, unhurried sound of something correctly latched. Crandall looked at the folder in his hands. "The beginning," he said. "It's where everyone starts." She stood, picked up her notebook. Or where they don't. One of the two. Yet, by 0900 hours, the base had settled into its regular operating rhythm. The comings and goings and maintenance schedules and training rotations that constituted daily life at a joint installation. The previous day's events had not disappeared, but they had been absorbed, the way significant events get absorbed by institutions that have been processing significant events for long enough. Not forgotten, but metabolized. Converted from shock into story, already beginning to calcify into the form they would hold for years. In the security operations room on the third floor of the B-Wing, Elena was 2 hours into the documentation process. She worked on a terminal that had been specifically isolated from the main network for this purpose. An air-gapped machine with its own power supply and a physical lock on the data port. The documentation she was producing was not a narrative account. It was a technical record, code sequences, timestamp logs, the exact architecture of the patches she'd applied, the specific syntax of the exploit she'd found and closed, written in a way that 3 other specialists, none of whom she had ever met, could independently verify and reproduce. Specialist Pack had been assigned to the room for support, which primarily meant sitting at an adjacent terminal, answering her occasional questions about archived system logs, and ensuring the coffee supply remained continuous. He was 19. He had been at Caldwell for 7 months. He had a habit of being very quiet in ways that were somehow not uncomfortable, the quietness of someone who was genuinely interested in what was happening around them rather than uncertain what to do with themselves. At 09:30, he said, without looking up from his terminal, "Can I ask you something?" "You're going to," Elena said, still typing. "The exploit," he said, "the legacy authentication protocol. Was it documented anywhere? Like, was there a known vulnerability on any of the standard watch lists?" She stopped typing. She looked at him. He had the expression of someone who had asked a question they weren't certain was welcome and was gauging the response carefully. "No," she said. "It wasn't on any watch list." "So how did you know to look there?" She turned back to the terminal. "I didn't. I looked everywhere." "But starting where?" She was quiet for a moment. The typing resumed slower. "Legacy systems," she said. "The oldest components. The ones that have been there so long, nobody thinks about them anymore." She paused. "The things that have been overlooked the longest are the most dangerous. Not because they're sophisticated, because everyone has stopped seeing them." Pack absorbed this. "Like, invisible because they're familiar," he said. "Yes." He turned back to his terminal. After a moment, without looking up, "That's kind of how the sergeant thing was, wasn't it? He stopped seeing people who weren't in his category." Elena looked at him. He had the grace not to look back. He appeared to be reading an access log with great interest. "Keep the coffee coming, specialist," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She went back to typing. The cursor moved steadily across the screen, converting 3 days of invisible, catastrophic, solitary work into language that other people could read. Outside, the base continued its daily rhythm. In room 14, the secure line to the Pentagon was still open. Drexler was on it, speaking in the careful, compressed syntax of someone managing upward through a chain of very concerned people, each of whom wanted an answer to a question that had multiple correct answers and several ways to phrase the most important one. In B Company, Brock Mercer reported to modified duty at 09:59, 4 minutes early, with his roster suspended and his conduct under formal review, and stood at the window of the duty room looking at the parking lot while the other NCOs did a careful, respectful job of not looking at him. In Sergeant Major Crandall's office, the small notepad with its torn-out page was back in the desk drawer. The 3 words on it had said what they needed to say. He was reading a unit readiness report now, pen in hand, making notes in the margins, doing the long, grinding, unglamorous work that kept 300 soldiers functional and operational and reasonably safe. And in the security operations room, Elena Voss wrote. She wrote for 6 hours straight, with 2 coffee breaks and 1 brief pause at 11:24 when her right hand cramped. She stretched it, flexed her fingers, held the hand under the desk for a moment where Pack couldn't see it, and then resumed. And the documentation grew from a blank screen to something real and complete and final. 47 pages of technical record that would pass through 6 levels of classification review, be verified by people in 3 different agencies, and eventually live in a secure archive that had no public index and no searchable database, and no indication in any system that most people would ever have clearance to access that it existed at all. At 15:46, she printed the final page, held it, read it once from beginning to end, with the specific attention of someone who had built something and needed to verify that what they'd built was exactly what they'd intended to build. It was. She stacked the pages, set them in the secure transfer folder, pressed the seal. "All right," she said. Pack looked up. She stood, picked up the folder, picked up her notebook, picked up the coffee cup that was empty, and she hadn't noticed for the last hour. "You've got good instincts," she said. Pack blinked. "Ma'am?" "Earlier, the question about the legacy systems." She looked at him. "That's not an obvious connection. Most people don't make it." He looked genuinely uncertain what to do with this. It seemed logical. Most logical things seem obvious after someone else says them." She tucked the folder under her arm. "Keep making the connections before someone else says them. That's the part that matters." She walked toward the door. Pack looked at the empty coffee station. Will you be back tomorrow?" he asked. She turned in the doorway. "I don't know," she said. It was the straightforward honesty of someone who genuinely didn't know rather than someone deflecting. "There's a situation developing in a different sector. If it escalates, I'll be redirected." "Okay." He nodded. "Okay, well," he stopped, seemed to recalibrate. "The coffee will be ready if you are." She looked at him. Something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one crossed her face. Brief, barely there, gone almost as soon as it arrived. Then she walked out. The secure operations room was quiet. Pack sat for a moment in the particular stillness left behind when someone significant has departed a space they had been filling in ways you hadn't entirely cataloged until they were gone. He turned back to his terminal. He opened the archived access logs. He started looking at the legacy system components, the oldest ones, the ones that had been there the longest, the ones that nobody thought about anymore. He didn't know why he was doing this exactly. It was past his shift. There was nothing on his task list that called for it. He did it anyway. The cursor blinked. Down the corridor, the secure transfer folder was in Osterfeld's hands, heading toward the classification review chain. In room 14, Drexler was still on the secure line, still managing upward, still using the word framework in context where it didn't quite fit. And somewhere in the building, Pack couldn't hear it from where he sat, couldn't have told you which direction. A door opened. A door closed. And the footsteps that followed moved with the particular quiet of someone who had learned, a long time ago, that the most important work rarely announced itself. The archived access logs were still open on Pack's terminal when the first alert came in. It didn't announce itself dramatically. It never did. That was the thing about the alerts that mattered, the ones that turned out to be real. They arrived in the same format as the nuisance alerts, the false positives, the system check notifications that populated the queue every Tuesday morning with the dull consistency of something that had been automated so long ago, nobody remembered setting it up. A small amber indicator in the upper corner of the monitoring dashboard. A timestamp, a 4-digit code. Pack looked at it. He looked at the legacy system components he had been examining for the last 40 minutes. He looked at the amber indicator again. He picked up his radio. The corridor outside the security operations room connected, via a right turn and a set of fire doors, to the classification transit hallway where Osterfeld had been walking with Elena's documentation folder. He had gotten approximately 30 feet past those fire doors when his earpiece produced a sound. Not a word, just a tone. 2 short pulses that made him stop walking. He turned around. At the same moment, Captain Drexler's secure line in room 14 produced a different tone, a harder one. In the base security monitoring station on the second floor of the A-Wing, 3 displays that had been showing routine traffic data shifted simultaneously to a different read. The duty officer, a lieutenant named Ferris, who had been at Caldwell for 18 months and who would, in the years following this night, cite this specific hour as the moment her understanding of her job permanently changed, leaned forward in her chair. "What is that?" she said. Not a question, more the verbal equivalent of reaching for something. The specialist beside her was already pulling up the secondary display. "Authentication anomaly," he said. "Node cluster. It's the SATCOM relay. Multiple nodes. Same signature as..." He stopped. They both looked at the timestamp on the anomaly. It had started 11 minutes ago. Elena was in the stairwell between floors 2 and 3 when her personal device, not a phone, something smaller and less identifiable, clipped to the inside of her jacket, produced a single vibration, then two more in quick succession. She stopped on the landing, looked at the device. The three-pulse sequence was not a standard alert. It was a code she had set herself, assigned to a monitoring thread she had left running on an isolated partition of the security operations terminal before she walked out 40 minutes ago. A thread watching for something specific, a behavioral pattern, a signature, a particular way of moving through network architecture that she had seen before and had not been able to stop thinking about. She went back up the stairs. Pack was standing when she came through the door, which was not a decision he'd made consciously. He had just risen from his chair at some point during the last 90 seconds and hadn't sat back down. He had the radio in one hand and the secondary display pulled up on his terminal, and the expression of someone who was certain they were seeing something real and very much wanted to be wrong. "Tell me," she said. "Authentication anomaly, SATCOM relay cluster. Started at..." He checked the timestamp. 1612. I didn't catch it until 1623 because it wasn't triggering the primary threshold. It's running below the monitoring threshold, she said. Yes. She was already at the terminal. Same signature? Similar. Not identical. The pattern is related, but the approach vector is different. Like it's the same architect, different door. She sat down. Her hands were on the keyboard. Get me a direct line to the monitoring station. Not through the standard channel. Direct line, physical intercom. And get Osterfeld. He's in the transit corridor, so get him. Pack moved. Elena looked at the display. The amber indicator had been joined by two more. 3 nodes now. The anomaly was spreading. Not fast, not in the obvious way that would have triggered every alarm in the building and brought 50 people running. Spreading carefully, methodically. The way something spreads when it has been designed by someone who knows exactly where the alarms are and how to move around them. She had spent 38 hours inside the architecture of this network. She knew its corridors and its junctions and its old, forgotten rooms the way you know a building you've spent a significant portion of your life in. And what she was looking at now was not a new intrusion. It was a continuation of the one she had closed. Except she had closed it. She was certain she had closed it. She ran the termination log. Pulled it from the archive, checked the timestamp, checked the confirmation sequence. It was there. Correct. Complete. The threat vector was documented as closed at 11:14 hours yesterday. She pulled up the current anomaly and set it against the termination log, looked at both, sat back in her chair. Oh, she said quietly. It was not a word that conveyed surprise. It was the word of someone who has just seen the answer to a question they hadn't known they were asking, and the answer was both logical and worse than they'd anticipated. Pack came back through the door with Osterfeld behind him, and behind Osterfeld was Lieutenant Ferris from the monitoring station, who had apparently decided to come in person rather than wait for a relay. Chief Voss, Ferris said. She was 26 and composed in the way of someone who had been working hard at composure for long enough that it had become partially genuine. We're showing 3 anomalous nodes on the SATCOM cluster. The signature is... I see it, Elena said. Who else knows? Monitoring station. My duty specialist. Osterfeld. General Hale? Osterfeld said. I'm calling him now. Don't use the standard channel. He looked at her. Use the hardline in the filing room, she said. Physical handset. Don't route through the base comm system. Chief, if this is what I think it is, the standard comms channel has already been compromised. She turned back to the terminal. 19 minutes ago, in fact. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Osterfeld turned and went to the filing room. The thing that Elena had found, sitting in the chair at 16:27 hours with 3 amber indicators on a display and a growing certainty in her chest that felt like cold water, was this. The attack she had terminated at 11:14 hours yesterday had not been a single event. It had been a probe. A very sophisticated, very patient probe designed to map the network's response to an intrusion, to identify what triggered alarms, what didn't, who responded, how fast, what methods they used, and then to withdraw before the mapping could be identified as a probe rather than an attack. She had found the intrusion and closed it. That was real. The threat vector she had documented was genuinely closed. But the intelligence the probe had collected had already been transmitted. Someone had spent 72 hours watching her fight the reconnaissance operation. had watched her methods, her entry points, her timing, her decisions, had recorded all of it, and now they were using it. The new intrusion was not moving around the patches she'd applied, it was moving around her. This was the thing she sat with for the 90 seconds before Ferris and Osterfeld arrived. The understanding that she was not fighting a static adversary. She was fighting someone who had studied her, who had watched her work and learned from it, and who was now applying that learning in real time. That changed the problem considerably. General Hale arrived at the security operations room at 16:41 hours, 12 minutes after Osterfeld's call, which meant he had been moving fast, which meant Osterfeld had communicated the severity accurately and without embellishment, which was why Hale kept Osterfeld. He came through the door and went directly to Elena's terminal. "Talk to me," he said. "The first event was reconnaissance," she said. "Whoever built it, let us find it, let me close it, and use the process of us closing it to gather operational intelligence on our response architecture." She pulled up the two displays side by side, the termination log and the current anomaly. "They watched how I work, and now they're using it." Hale looked at the displays. "You're certain?" 68%, she said, "which I know isn't the number you want. It's the honest number." "Yes." He straightened, looked at Osterfeld. "What's the current status on the affected nodes?" Osterfeld had been running the monitoring feed on his tablet. 4 nodes now, still below primary threshold. If we don't intervene, the monitoring systems are going to start flagging this in, he checked, 18 to 20 minutes. Standard automated response will initiate. And if the standard automated response initiates, Elena said, it will follow the same protocols the previous response followed, which they've already mapped. The room understood this. Standard response was now a liability. Hale turned to Ferris. "Shut down the automated response system." Ferris blinked. "Sir, the automated response system is—" "I know what it is. Shut it down." "General, shutting down automated response requires authorization from—" "I'm authorizing it." He held her gaze. "Now." Ferris picked up the intercom. While she was doing that, Hale turned back to Elena. "What do you need?" "Time and quiet," she said, "and I need everyone to stop doing what they would normally do in this situation. Define everyone. Anyone with access to the comms infrastructure, anyone who would normally be initiating a standard incident response." She paused. "The response protocol is the attack surface. If we respond the way we're supposed to respond, they will use that response to get further in." Drexler had arrived in the doorway. Elena hadn't seen him come in. He had a jacket on over a shirt that suggested he had not been prepared to leave his room when the summons came, and he was holding a tablet and looking at the displays with an expression that moved through several phases rapidly before settling on the one he usually wore, careful, contained, working the information. "What you're describing," he said from the doorway, "is a situation where our own protocols are being weaponized against us." "Yes, that's a significant operational vulnerability." She looked at him. "I'm aware of that." "If this gets out, Mr. Drexler," Hale said. The two words carried enough weight to close the sentence Drexler had been opening. Drexler closed it. "Tell me what you're going to do," Hale said to Elena. She looked at the display. 4 amber indicators. The 4th had appeared 3 minutes ago. The spread was slowing, not stopping, but slowing, which meant either the intrusion was consolidating rather than expanding, or it was pausing to assess, or— "They know I'm back in the room," she said. Everyone looked at her. "The spread slowed 14 seconds after I reactivated this terminal. The pattern shifted." She tracked the display. "They're adaptive. They have real-time visibility on at least part of the monitoring layer, and they're adjusting based on what they see." She paused. "Which means they can see that the response is different." "Different how?" Osterfeld asked. "Last time, the response to anomalous nodes was automated and sequential. This time, it stopped before it started. That's not a pattern match for any standard protocol." She tilted her head slightly. "That's going to make them cautious." "Cautious is good," Pack said. He was still standing near his terminal, having apparently decided that his function in this situation was to stay out of the way of everyone more senior while remaining close enough to be useful. "Cautious is a pause," Elena said. "It's not good or bad. It's a window." She looked at the display for another moment. Then she pulled a blank document onto the secondary screen and started writing. Not code, not yet. A map, notations, network topology sketched in text shorthand, a working diagram of the current intrusion overlaid on her memory of the network's architecture. Her handwriting on the digital interface was the same compressed personal code as in her notebook. Fast, specific, almost illegible to anyone standing behind her. Almost. Pack was reading it. She didn't look up to notice, or if she noticed, she chose not to address it. "General," she said, still writing, "I need you to do something that is going to feel wrong." Hale waited. "I need the base to respond normally." The room processed this. "You said," Ferris started. "I said the standard automated response is a liability. That's different from normal human behavior within the system." She stopped writing, turned in the chair. "They're watching the monitoring layer. They can see what the automated systems are doing. What they can't see, what they shouldn't be able to see, if my assessment of the intrusion architecture is correct, is personnel movement, physical actions." Hale understood before she finished saying it. "You want them to see a normal base running a normal incident response, while we do something entirely different underneath it." She turned back to the screen. "If they see nothing, they'll know we're onto them and they'll pull back and we'll have a window of maybe 3 hours before they reposition. If they see the standard response pattern, they'll use it, and I'll use them using it to find the second layer." "The second layer," Drexler said. "There's always a second layer," she said. "The first event was reconnaissance. The current event is the opening move. If they've built this the way I think they've built it, there's a component we haven't seen yet, something they're covering with the current intrusion." She paused. "I need to find it before they deploy it." Silence. Hale looked at the 4 amber indicators on the display. He looked at Elena. He had commanded units in 3 combat theaters and had developed over 30 years a specific trust in specific kinds of people, not the people who were always confident, but the people who calibrated their confidence to the actual available information and told you the honest number, even when it wasn't what you wanted to hear. 68%. "Osterfeld," he said. "Restart the automated response sequence, standard protocol, by the book." Osterfeld looked at Ferris. Ferris picked up the intercom. "Drexler," Hale said, "you're going to make 3 calls in the next 10 minutes. Use the standard secure line. Make them look like the calls you'd normally make at this stage of an incident." Drexler stared at him. "You want me to perform a normal response?" "I want you to give them what they expect to see." A beat. "What if they're recording the content of the calls? Then keep the content consistent with normal protocol." Hale's voice was even. "Can you do that?" Drexler looked at the display, looked at Elena, who had turned back to her terminal and was no longer part of the room's conversation in any immediately accessible way. "Yes," Drexler said. "Good." Hale turned to Pack. "Specialist." Pack straightened. "Sir." "You've been watching what she's doing." Pack opened his mouth, seemed to consider whether this was the moment to disclaim, decided against it. "Yes, sir." "Stay. Whatever she asks for, you get it. Whatever she needs you to run, you run. You don't leave this room." "Yes, sir." Haley moved to the wall beside the terminal, not in Elena's sight line, not in her way, but present. The way a commander is present in the room where the decisive work is happening without being the person doing the decisive work. He had learned this decades ago from a superior officer who had been very good at knowing where to stand. The room reorganized itself. Osterfeld relayed the restart order. The automated response sequence came back online, its indicators reappearing on the monitoring dashboard, moving through their standard checklist with the reliable sequential logic of a system that had no idea it was now a theater piece. Ferris returned to the monitoring station to manage the visible response. Drexler stepped into the hallway with his tablet, and in the security operations room with the automated systems running their performance, and the general standing against the wall and Pack at the adjacent terminal and nobody else present, Elena Voss worked. The thing about fighting an adaptive adversary, the thing that distinguished it from every other kind of problem, was that the adversary was a living variable. It was not a lock with a fixed mechanism. It was a mind, or a collection of minds, operating in real time, making decisions based on incomplete information just like she was, capable of surprise in both directions. This made it harder, and in a way that she would have been reluctant to admit to anyone who hadn't done this work themselves, it was the part that kept her in the job. She found the second layer at 1712 hours. It wasn't elegant. It didn't announce itself. It was a single anomalous data packet, not a node, not an authentication flag, but a tiny packet of encrypted data moving through a communications channel that should have had no active traffic at this time of day. A maintenance channel. One of the legacy paths that ran parallel to the main architecture and had been built in the early years of the system. When redundancy meant physical redundancy, and the idea of using digital pathways as attack vectors was still theoretical. It had been there since the previous night, before she had terminated the first attack. She sat with this for a moment. It had been there before she'd started fighting the first attack, which meant it hadn't been placed by the attack. It had been placed before the attack, possibly much before, possibly months before, sitting dormant in a maintenance channel that nobody monitored because it was too old to be on the active watch list and too obscure to be on the legacy review schedule. She pulled the packet as metadata, looked at the encoding. "Pack," she said. "Ma'am. The maintenance channel database, the archived one, not the active system. I need access to every traffic log it has, all of them." "That's going to be..." He started pulling up the request interface. "That database is read only. I'd need a Class 4 access to..." "Ask the general." Pack looked at Hale. Hale said, "Give her the access." "Sir, technically the Class 4 authorization requires..." "Specialist." Hale's voice was gentle and very final. "Give her the access." The access appeared on Elena's terminal 40 seconds later. She went into the archived traffic logs and started running a search, not for the packet itself, but for its structure. The encoding pattern, the packet size, the specific timing intervals, looking for other instances. Other times, this same structural signature had passed through this channel. The search returned results. She looked at the earliest timestamp. She looked at it again. 14 months. The packet had first appeared in the maintenance channel 14 months ago. She sat very still for a moment with this information. 14 months, which meant that whatever was sitting in that channel, whatever was encoded in that stream of dormant, patient, perfectly camouflaged data, had been there since before the first attack, since before the reconnaissance, since before any of the events that had brought her to Fort Caldwell, which meant the reconnaissance and the first attack and the current intrusion were not the operation. They were the distraction for the operation that had already happened. "General," she said. Hill was beside her in 4 steps. She pointed at the screen. He looked at the timestamp. The sound he made was not loud. It was barely audible. But it was the specific sound of a senior officer absorbing information that fundamentally reorganizes their understanding of a situation they thought they understood. "What is it carrying?" he asked. "I don't know yet. The encoding is... It's good. It's very good." She was already running a decryption analysis. "Give me time." "How much time?" "I don't know." "Elena." He used her name, not her rank, not her designation. "We're potentially talking about 14 months of..." "I know what we're potentially talking about." She didn't look up. "Give me time." He straightened. He turned to Pack. "Nobody enters this room. Nobody. If the Joint Chiefs call, tell them the general is unavailable and get the message." Pack said, "Yes, sir." Hale turned back to the wall. Elena worked. The decryption was not fast. It required building a model of the encoding structure, not breaking it brute force, but understanding it, finding the internal logic, the mathematical skeleton underneath the obfuscation. This was the part of the work that didn't look like much from the outside. Long minutes of apparent stillness with rapid bursts of activity, the visible output telling you almost nothing about the complexity of the process underneath. At 17:39, she stopped, pulled her hands back from the keyboard, closed her eyes for exactly 5 seconds, opened them, ran a different approach. At 17:51, she found the key, not a key in the conventional sense, not a string she could enter and have the content display itself. A structural key. A pattern in the encoding that revealed how the data was organized, and once you knew how it was organized, you could begin to read it. She began to read it. She read for 11 minutes without speaking. Hale stood against the wall and watched her face and said nothing, because he had been in enough rooms with enough people doing enough high-stakes work to know that the face of someone reading something important tells you more than asking them will, and what Elena's face was telling him was not good. At 18:02, she stopped reading. She sat back in the chair. She put both hands flat on the table beside the keyboard, not on the keyboard, beside it, and looked at the wall display with the expression of someone completing a calculation they were hoping would resolve differently than it had. "Tell me," Hale said. She exhaled through her nose. Once. Controlled. "It's a collection package," she said. "Active for 14 months. The maintenance channel was used as a passive relay. It collected data from the systems it was adjacent to and packaged it in intervals, small enough not to register, regular enough to be consistent." She paused. Every 14 days it transmitted. Through the maintenance channel, through a routing path that looked like system noise, out through a satellite uplink that's designated as a backup atmospheric monitoring relay. Hale was very still. "What did it collect?" he said. "Communications," she said. "Encrypted channel traffic, authentication sequences, personnel movement logs, operational scheduling for the SATCOM relay cluster." She looked at him. "Personnel assignment logs. For the last 14 months, whoever built this has had a near-complete picture of this installation's operational scheduling and communications architecture." The room was quiet. Pack had stopped moving. "How complete?" Hale asked. "Complete enough to plan around," she said. "Complete enough to know when the SATCOM relay cluster would be at minimum staffing. Complete enough to time the first attack for a window when the automated response systems would be running on a reduced crew." She held his gaze. "They didn't get lucky with the timing of the first attack. They scheduled it." Hale turned to face the wall for a moment. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was simply the movement of a man who needed 2 seconds without anyone being able to read his face. Then he turned back. "The current intrusion," he said. "The one that started at 1612. Cover," she said. "They knew I'd found the first attack because the first attack was designed to be found. They knew my response pattern from watching it. The current intrusion is running the response pattern they predicted I'd use, but the automated systems, the standard protocol chain, which was going to keep me occupied while the collection package completed one more transmission cycle." "When is the transmission window?" She looked at the timeline. 43 minutes, she said. "At 1845, the package initiates its next cycle." Hale checked his watch. "Can you stop it?" She looked at the screen. "I can stop this specific transmission cycle," she said. "I can shut down the maintenance channel and interrupt the relay path before it gets to the satellite uplink." She paused. "But if I do that, whoever built this will know it's been found. They'll know the whole architecture has been compromised, which means they'll have contingencies we haven't seen yet, and they'll implement them. And we'll be starting from zero with 14 months of collected intelligence already in someone else's hands." Hale looked at her. "What's the alternative?" She didn't answer immediately. She was looking at the display, but her gaze had the unfocused quality of someone looking through rather than at, working through a problem that was happening in a different space than the one visible on the screen. "Let it transmit," she said. "Elena, let it transmit but corrupt the payload." She turned to the keyboard. "If I can access the collection package's output buffer before the transmission cycle, I can alter the contents, not block them, alter them. Substitute corrupted data for the legitimate collection. They receive a transmission that looks normal, contains the expected data structure, but the actual content is..." She was already working. Noise, garbage, 14 months of collection, and the last transmission they get is a package that tells them nothing. Pack made a sound that was not quite a word. Hale looked at the terminal. "How long?" 38 minutes, if everything goes right. "And if everything doesn't go right?" She didn't look up. "Then we have a different conversation in 39 minutes. Hale was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you need?" "Silence," she said. "And Pack?" "You've got both?" He turned to the door. "I'll be in the corridor. Osterfeld." Osterfeld appeared from the hallway. "Get Drexler. Tell him to keep the standard response running for another 45 minutes, and not to deviate from protocol under any circumstances." He moved toward the door. "And tell him if anyone asks, the situation is being managed." "Is it being managed?" Osterfeld asked. Hale glanced back at the room. at Elena's hands moving across the keyboard, at Pac pulling up the buffer access protocols, at the display with its amber indicators and its 14-month timestamp and its 43-minute window. "It's being managed," he said. The door closed. Dziękuję. 38 minutes was not a number Elena had arrived at conservatively. It was the outer boundary of a range that started at 26 and ended at 38, and the range was wide because the problem had variables she hadn't fully mapped yet, and she knew it. And she didn't share this with Pac because Pac needed to be focused, and the specific texture of her uncertainty was not information that would help him be focused. The collection package's output buffer was not a simple system. Whoever had built it with the assumption that it might eventually need to survive a hostile environment, a reasonable assumption for something designed to operate covertly inside a military installation for over a year. The buffer had redundancies, multiple encoding layers, a verification checksum that would detect naive substitution attempts and trigger an abort. The checksum was the problem. She spent 11 minutes on the checksum. "Talk to me," Pac said at minute 8. "I'm working on the checksum." "The verification, yes. If the substitution triggers the abort, I know." A pause. "The abort would notify the sender," he said. "Yes." "Which would tell them the package has been compromised." "Pac." She kept typing. "I know." "Okay." He went back to his terminal. 30 seconds of silence. Then, "What if we don't substitute the whole payload?" She stopped. "What if we substitute a specific layer?" he said, still looking at his screen. "Not the data structure. Leave the structure intact so the checksum reads clean. Just the indexed content within the structure. If the checksum validates structure rather than content..." She looked at the checksum code on her screen. She looked at the data architecture. "The checksum validates structural integrity," she said slowly, "not semantic content." She was already pulling up the indexed content layer. "That might work," she said. "It might not." "No." She was typing again, faster now. "But it's better than what I was doing." Pac allowed himself a brief, carefully private expression of, not pride exactly, something quieter than pride. The particular satisfaction of having a thought that turned out to be useful. Then he went back to supporting her. "What?" At 18:36, 9 minutes before the transmission window, Elena finished the substitution. She ran the verification locally, not the package's own checksum, but her own analysis of what the checksum would see versus what was actually in the payload. The checksum would see a structurally intact data package. The payload contained 412 days worth of maintenance channel noise, system handshakes, automated status pings, the kind of digital static that meant nothing to anyone and filled the data architecture in a way that was exactly consistent with legitimate collection. The actual collected intelligence, the communications logs, the authentication sequences, the 14 months of operational data, was gone from the payload. She ran the verification 3 more times. It held each time. At 18:41, she sat back. "It's ready," she said. Pac looked up. She looked at the clock. 4 minutes. She got up from the chair, went to the door, opened it. Hale was in the corridor, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, the posture of someone who has been waiting in corridors for decades and has developed a way of doing it that didn't visibly consume him. 4 minutes, she said. He came back into the room. They stood. All 3 of them. Hale against the wall, Pac at his terminal, Elena standing in the center of the room with her arms at her sides, and watched the clock on the display. At 18:44, the collection package initiated its transmission cycle. The indicators on the monitoring display shifted. A brief pattern of activity in the maintenance channel, the relay path lighting up in sequence, the satellite uplink registering a data event. At 18:45, the transmission completed. The indicators returned to their dormant state. The maintenance channel went quiet. The display showed nothing. Elena let out a breath, not a long breath, not a theatrical one, just the involuntary release of the specific muscular tension that comes from holding something very carefully for a very long time. "Clean," Pac said. He was reading the verification log. "Checksum passed. Transmission completed. The package..." He looked at the output data. "The package delivered." "What they received," Hale said. "Noise," Elena said. 14 months of noise. Hale was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. Now we shut down the channel. Now we shut down the channel. She sat back down. And then we have to talk about who built this. Because someone put that package in the maintenance channel 14 months ago. Someone with physical access to this installation. The word landed in the room with the specific weight of words that reorganize the geography of a situation. Physical access. Not a remote intrusion, not an external adversary working from a distance. Someone who had been here. Someone who might still be here. Hale looked at the display. The clock read 1847. Outside, down the corridor and through the fire doors and across the building and into the fading evening light, Fort Caldwell was running through its nightly rhythm. The shift changes and the dinner lines and the personnel moving between buildings with their collars up against the cold, as ordinary and unremarkable as any base on any night, as unaware of what had just happened in a small room on the second floor as the base had been unaware, for 14 months, of the thing that had been quietly watching it. Palais picked up the intercom to Osterfeld. He said 3 words, Condition 4, now. And then the alarm that nobody had heard yet, the alarm that had been running in the background of everything for over a year, finally became visible. Condition 4 was not a designation that most of the personnel at Fort Caldwell had seen activated in their time at the installation. It existed in the base's operational protocols as a theoretical category, a step below full lockdown, a step above elevated security, defined by specific physical and procedural requirements that most people had read about during orientation and then filed in the back of the mind alongside other things that applied to other situations. At 1848 hours, it became a present tense situation. The announcement came through the PA system in the clipped, specific cadence that the base's operations desk used when they were reading directly from protocol, not the voice of someone improvising, but the voice of someone executing a checklist. Building access restrictions. Personnel accountability requirements. Vehicle movement suspended base-wide. Non-essential personnel to quarters. Essential personnel to hold position and await further instruction. In the NCO barracks, Brock Mercer heard the announcement and sat up from his bunk. He had been lying down with his boots on, which was the posture of someone who wasn't sleeping but wasn't doing anything else either. He listened to the full announcement. He looked at the wall. He looked at the duty roster on his whiteboard, with his name crossed off the active column, and moved to the modified roster. He put his boots on properly, laced them, and went to the window. The base outside was doing the thing bases did under Condition 4, movement changing quality, becoming purposeful and directed, vehicles stopping where they were, people converging on designated hold points with the particular rapid orderly motion of trained personnel executing a protocol they'd rehearsed but never used. He didn't know what had happened. He knew it was connected to the woman in the gray jacket because everything that had changed at Fort Caldwell in the last 24 hours was connected to the woman in the gray jacket, and he was no longer under any illusions about the radius of what he didn't know. He sat back down on the bunk. He waited. In the security operations room, the Condition 4 announcement was background to the work still happening at Elena's terminal. The channel shutdown was proceeding, methodical, sequential, closing down the maintenance relay path one node at a time from the outside in, working back toward the installation point where the collection package had been physically embedded in the system. The installation point was the thing that mattered now, not the software. Software didn't install itself. Someone had put that package into the maintenance channel 14 months ago. And to do that, they had needed physical access to a specific server room in the B wing. And physical access to that server room required either a clearance level that appeared on a short list or someone who had bypassed the access control entirely. Colonel Marsh had been summoned. She arrived at 1856, 2 minutes after Osterfeld's call, still in full uniform, which told Elena she had been in her office rather than her quarters when the condition change came through, which meant she had been waiting for something. Not this specifically, but something. The condition in which you keep your uniform on at 1856 hours is the condition of expecting a situation to develop. "Colonel," Hale said. He was standing at the center of the room now, which was where he had moved when the work had shifted from technical to operational. "We need the physical access logs for the B-Wing server facilities. 14 months, full record. Manual and digital both." Marsh looked at the displays. Took in the room. Elena at the terminal, Pack beside her, Osterfeld near the door, the general at the center. "What happened?" she said. Briefing in 10 minutes. Access logs first. She held his gaze for a half second. Not resistance, just the calibration of someone who needed to know if there was a reason for the sequence. Then she picked up her radio. "Hendricks," she said. The response was immediate. Her aide. "I need the physical access logs for B-Wing server rooms 7 through 12. Full record, last 16 months. Physical copies from the security desk and digital from the system. Bring them to SOC-R. Now." She lowered the radio. 10 minutes, she said to Hale. "Good." She looked at Elena's back. "Is the threat contained?" she said. Elena didn't turn around. "The immediate transmission threat is contained. The source is still unidentified. The source being the person who physically installed the package." "Yes." Marsh absorbed this. "You're telling me we have a personnel problem." "I'm telling you the package required physical installation," Elena said. "What that means about personnel is a question for your counterintelligence section and the general. My part is finding where it was installed and documenting the access path." "Your part," Marsh repeated. There was something in her tone, not sharp, but present. The tone of someone registering a boundary that had been drawn and deciding how they felt about it. She looked at Hale. "I want to be in the briefing," she said. "You'll be in the briefing," he said. "Sit down, Adrian." The access logs arrived at 1913. Hendricks, Marsh's aide, a competent captain who moved with the efficient unhurriedness of someone who had spent years making sure things arrived on time, brought them in 2 folders, one thick, one thin. Digital on a locked tablet, physical on paper, the kind of physical record that security-critical facilities maintained because paper didn't get hacked. Elena stopped what she was doing. She took the physical folder first. She read it the way she read everything, fast, but not skimming. There was a difference between fast reading and shallow reading, and she had spent enough time working with dense technical records that she'd trained herself to compress the former without incurring the latter. The B-Wing server rooms had individual access logs, entry timestamp, exiting timestamp, personnel ID, authorization level, stated purpose. Standard format, the kind of record that was meticulous about the visible aspects of access and almost completely blind to what someone did inside the room once they were logged in. She worked backward from the present, past the recent incident, past the 6 months prior to it, into the range she was looking for, a window of 2 to 4 weeks, 14 months ago, within which the package had most likely been installed given its earliest recorded activity. She found the window. She found 7 access events within it for the specific server room adjacent to the maintenance channel entry point. She read the 7 names. She set the folder down. "Pack," she said. "Pull the personnel records for these." She wrote the 7 ID numbers on a slip of paper and handed it to him. "Current assignment status. Separation dates, if applicable." Pack took the slip and started typing. Hale came to the table and looked at the access log over her shoulder. She didn't move the folder. Let him read it. 7 people, he said. 7 authorized entries in the relevant window. The installation could have been done in under 4 minutes, could have been wrapped in any of these visits. She paused. Or it could have been someone who didn't use the standard access system. A bypass. The physical lock on B7 has a standard override for emergency maintenance access. The override is logged separately. She turned to Hendricks, who was still near the door. "Is the emergency override log in here?" Hendricks looked at the folder he'd brought. "That would be a separate system. Facilities management." "I need it. He looked at Marsh. She nodded. He picked up his radio. While they waited, Pack had pulled up the personnel records. 7 IDs, he said. 6 are currently on active roster at Caldwell or other installations in the system. He paused. 1 separated 14 months ago. The room registered this. "Separated how?" Hale said. "Administrative discharge." Pack read from the screen. "Technical Specialist Level 3. Attached to the B-Wing Infrastructure Maintenance Unit. Discharged." He checked the date. 12 days after the earliest entry event in the access log. Elena looked at the date on the log. Then at the discharge date Pack had read. 12 days. Someone had installed the package, then left the installation 12 days later through an administrative discharge. "What was the discharge reason?" Marsh said. She had moved to Pack's terminal without anyone noticing her do it. "Performance review deficiency," Pack read. "Conduct evaluation. Marginal. Recommended for separation by the unit supervisor. Processed and approved at the installation level. Who was the unit supervisor? Hale said. Pack looked at the record. He said a name. The name was not one that Elena recognized. It was not one that made anyone else in the room visibly react. But Marsh, standing beside Pack's terminal, went very still in the specific way of someone who has heard a word that connects to something they were not expecting it to connect to. Hale noticed. "Colonel," he said. Marsh looked at the name on the screen. "I know him," she said, quietly. He's at a different installation now. He transferred 8 months ago." She paused. "I processed the transfer recommendation." The room waited. "He asked to transfer," she said. "Operational workload reasons. His unit was being restructured. It was a standard transfer." She was looking at the screen, not at the room. "I didn't—" She stopped. "It was a standard transfer." "Is he still active?" Hale said. "As of last week, yes." She turned. "He's at Garrison Falk." "Osterfeld." Osterfeld was already at the door. "Sir, get me a direct line to Garrison Falk Security Command. Secure channel, now." The next 45 minutes had the quality of time during which many things are happening simultaneously in different locations, and the people at the center of it can only see the parts that reach them through the relay of other people's reports. The secure line to Garrison Falk connected at 1941. Hale spoke for 4 minutes. He did not explain the full scope of the situation. He gave the counterintelligence request in the specific compressed language of someone who had done this before and knew that the less context you gave the receiving end, the less time they spent asking questions instead of acting. The response from Garrison Falk's Security Command was the kind of response that told you, by its speed and its brevity, that the situation was already moving. At 2003, Garrison Falk Security confirmed that the individual in question had not reported for duty that day. At 2011, they confirmed he was not in his quarters. At 2019, they confirmed his vehicle was missing from the base lot. Hale put down the handset. He looked at Elena. She had not stopped working during the 45 minutes. She had been building the technical documentation of the collection package, not the broad strokes that would go in the classified report, but the forensic record, the exact architecture of how it had been built and embedded and operated, the kind of evidence that would survive a legal proceeding. Because at some point, it would need to survive a legal proceeding. "He's gone," Hale said. "I heard." "That complicates the criminal's—" "That's not my part," she said. Again, not dismissively, just precisely. "The technical record will be complete by morning. Where it goes from there is law enforcement and counterintelligence. I'll testify to whatever I documented. The documentation will support prosecution. If they find him, that's also not my part." She typed for a moment, stopped. "He'll be found. Someone who runs from a military installation on a scheduled day has already made the decision that changes everything. That's a different kind of problem than the one I've been working on." Drexler appeared in the doorway. He had been managing the visible response for the last 2 hours. The deliberate performance of normalcy that had given Elena the window she needed. He looked tired in the specific way of someone who has been careful for too long and whose carefulness had finally run out of fuel. "Is it over?" he said. Hale looked at Elena. She looked at the clock, then at the display. The maintenance channel was fully shut down. The transmission window had closed. The collection package was neutralized. The current intrusion, the one that had started this entire chain at 1612 hours, had, at some point in the last 90 minutes, simply stopped, withdrawn. The same way the first one had withdrawn, except this time it was not a tactical retreat. This time she thought it was someone who knew it was over. "The immediate threat is over," she said. Drexler exhaled. "The broader situation," Hale said carefully, "is going to require a significant—" "I know what it's going to require," Drexler said. He came fully into the room, sat down in the chair nearest the door, which was not the chair of someone asserting authority, but the chair of someone who needed to sit. 14 months of collection. We're going to need to assess every operation that was scheduled through this installation during that window. Every personnel assignment, every communication that—" He stopped. "This is going to take months." "Yes," Elena said. "And the attribution. If the person who built this on behalf of—" The behavioral signatures are consistent with what I documented in the first event, she said. I'll include the attribution assessment in the technical record. 73% confidence on the external actor. The human intelligence, who recruited the technical specialist, how, when. That's counterintelligence's problem. Drexler looked at her. You don't separate cleanly from these things, he said. You know that. Whatever you found, wherever it points, you'll be testifying for the next 2 years. She didn't respond immediately. I know, she said. Doesn't that... He seemed to look for a word and settle for an imprecise one. Doesn't that bother you? She looked at him. Would it change anything if it did? She said. He didn't have an answer for that. Well, at 20:47, General Hale called the full debrief. Room 14. Same cast as the briefing 2 days prior, with the addition of Colonel Marsh, a counterintelligence officer named Sayers, who had driven from the regional CY field office and arrived looking like someone who had expected a routine consultation and gotten something considerably less routine, and a woman named Dr. Pell, a behavioral analyst attached to the NSA liaison office who had been at the installation for the last 20 hours without anyone having explained to her why she was still there. Elena laid out the technical picture in the same compressed, precise format she always used. No padding, no theater. The facts in the order that made their relationships clear. The room listened differently than it had in the first briefing. In the first briefing, there had been the quality of people absorbing something they hadn't known. In this briefing, there was the quality of people hearing their frame reorganized around an event that was still happening. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Sayers said, "You're certain the payload was corrupted before transmission?" The verification log is documented. Pack can walk you through it if you want the technical specifics. Sayers looked at Pack, who nodded once with the particular composure of someone who had spent the last 3 hours in the most intense work of their professional life and was now doing a credible impression of someone who handled this regularly. And the original collected data, Sayers said. The 14 months of legitimate collection, where is that? Removed from the package during the substitution process, Elena said. So it's on an isolated partition of the SOCR terminal, encrypted with a key that currently exists only in my head. She paused. I'll transfer it to a certified evidence medium tonight. The full record is intact. It hasn't been transmitted. Whoever built the package did not receive it. Sayers sat back. Dr. Pell, who had been taking quiet notes throughout, looked up. The technical specialist who was discharged, she said. His access was legitimate during the installation window. What makes you confident the package was installed by him rather than by one of the other 6 individuals who accessed the same server room? Nothing makes me confident, Elena said. I'm not doing the human attribution. I documented the technical facts and the timeline. The fact that his departure date was 12 days after the installation window is a circumstantial indicator. It's the CI team's job to determine significance. But you have an opinion. I have a working hypothesis that I'm not going to put in a technical record because it's not technically supported. Pell looked at her steadily. What's the hypothesis? Elena looked back at her. The package was too clean to be someone's first attempt, she said. The encoding, the camouflage method, the choice of the maintenance channel specifically, those require familiarity with the system architecture that you don't pick up from standard access. Someone helped them understand the target, which means the human piece of this is probably bigger than one person. The room absorbed this. Marsh, who had been sitting at the end of the table since the debrief began, with the careful stillness of someone carrying a weight they hadn't been carrying this morning, said, "The transfer that I processed." Everyone looked at her. "I need to say this in the room," she said. "The transfer request was standard, documented. The reasons given were legitimate operational reasons. I had no indication..." She stopped. "I need it documented that the transfer was processed in good faith." Hale looked at her. "Adrienne." "I need it documented, Victor." "It will be documented." His voice was even. "No one is suggesting otherwise. Sayers is going to be pulling my communications for the last 14 months. Sayers started to say something. Hale held up a hand. "Everyone's communications," Hale said. "That's the scope of a 14-month collection event. It's not a reflection of suspicion toward any individual in this room." He held Marsh's gaze. "It's procedure." Marsh looked at the table. I know, she said. The debrief continued. At 22:31, the room finally emptied. Sayers and Pell left together, already in the first phase of a conversation that was going to continue for a very long time, in offices that Elena would probably never see. Drexler left with his tablet and the compressed, future-facing expression of someone who had a great many calls to make before morning. Marsh left last, after exchanging a few quiet words with Hale at the door. Words Elena didn't catch and didn't try to. Hale stayed. Osterfeld was in the corridor. Pack had gone to transfer the evidence partition to a certified medium, a process that would take him approximately 2 hours and which he had undertaken with the specific focus of someone who had been given a critical task and intended to do it exactly right. Room 14 was empty except for the two of them. Elena was still at the table. She had a pen in her hand and the notebook open, writing the kind of notes that wouldn't go in any official record. The texture of the work, the sequencing of the decisions, the moments where she had been wrong before she was right. The private accounting that she kept because the work demanded honesty about what had worked and what hadn't, even when there was no one to be honest with but herself. Hale sat down across from her. He didn't say anything for a moment. He had a cup of coffee. Someone had brought coffee at some point during the debrief, and it had gone largely undrunk and was now a cup that was being held rather than consumed. "You knew," he said, "when you walked out of this room with the documentation folder at 1600, you knew there was something else." She didn't look up from the notebook. "I suspected. You left a monitoring thread running. Standard practice." "Elena," his voice was quiet. "You left a monitoring thread calibrated to a specific signature that you hadn't shared with the technical team, running on an isolated partition before you walked out to eat dinner." He paused. "That's not standard practice. That's a specific decision based on a specific suspicion." She wrote for another moment. "When I found the first attack," she said, "it was already too clean, too completable. Something that's sophisticated doesn't withdraw before it achieves its objective, unless the withdrawal is the objective." She closed the notebook. "I couldn't document that. I had no technical support for it. But I left the thread because if I was wrong, it costs nothing, and if I was right, you needed a 30-second window. I needed to be in the room when it started." He looked at her. 48 hours ago," he said, "I told a cafeteria full of soldiers that the threat was resolved. The first threat was resolved. You knew there was a second one. I knew it was possible." She looked at him. "There's a difference." He considered this. "There's a version of the last 48 hours, he said carefully, where the communication to the Pentagon, the confirmation that the threat was closed, created operational complacency that made the second event harder to respond to. Yes, that's a problem. Yes, because the complacency was created by accurate reporting of an incomplete picture." She held his gaze. "An incomplete picture was all I had. I know that." He set the coffee cup down. "I'm not," he exhaled. "I'm not assigning blame. I'm trying to understand the decision architecture so the debrief report doesn't—" "Victor." She said it the same way he'd used her name, without rank, just the word. "The decision architecture is, I found what I found, I reported what I documented, and I kept looking for the rest. That's the whole thing. If that created a problem, it's because the problem existed before I got here." He was quiet. "The collection package has been running for 14 months, she said. "I was here for 48 hours. Whatever the damage is, it predates me." She paused. "My job is to limit it. I'm limiting it." Hale looked at the table. Then he looked at his hands. There was something in the way he did it. Not defeated, but carrying weight that had redistributed itself over the course of the evening. The weight of a commander who had been managing upward while the decisive work happened below him, and who was honest enough with himself to know that the managing and the decisive work were not the same scale of contribution. "The cafeteria," he said. She waited. "What Mercer did." He looked up. "I want to know if you think I handled it correctly." She looked at him. It was a genuine question. She recognized it as genuine because it was the kind of question that a person with sufficient authority to not need to ask it would only ask if they actually wanted the answer. "You addressed it publicly," she said, "in the room where it happened. That was right. The weight of it matched the visibility of the incident." She paused. The consequences you issued were appropriate, not career-ending, structural enough to mean something. But she picked up her pen, turned it in her fingers. The speech, she said. In the cafeteria. The part about strength being measured by results. She paused. It was right, but it was also, she seemed to weigh the word. Performed. The room needed to hear it, and you gave the room what it needed, and that was a good decision. But the man you were saying it to wasn't going to hear it that way. He was going to hear a public lesson. And a public lesson teaches the audience, not the subject. Hale looked at her. The conversation this morning was more useful, she said. His conversation with Crandall, the one where he was in a room with me and had to say the unprepared thing. She paused. He said something honest. I don't know what comes of it, but it was a better foundation than the cafeteria speech. Hale was quiet for a moment. You saw that. Crandall told me what he said. And you think, I think some people need the visible event to break something loose, and then they need a quiet room to figure out what to do with it. She set the pen down. Mercer got both. Whether he uses them is his problem. Hale looked at the wall display, still showing the inactive monitoring dashboard. The amber indicators were gone. The system was quiet. I put him on modified duty, he said. I know. 90-day review. I know. Is that... He stopped. Seemed to decide something. Is that sufficient? She looked at him carefully. You're asking me if you went far enough. I'm asking for an honest assessment. She thought about it. Not performed consideration, actual consideration, the kind that meant something. If the review period is genuine, she said, if he's actually evaluated and the evaluation is actually used to determine what happens next. Yes, it's sufficient. She paused. If it's paperwork that expires in 90 days and he goes back to the same roster with nothing changed, then no, it wasn't. The review will be genuine. Then it's sufficient. Hale nodded. He stood, picked up the coffee cup, looked at it, set it back down. The documentation will be completed by when, he said. Tomorrow, noon. I'll need a classified courier and a direct line to NSA archive for the transmission. You'll have both. He moved toward the door. Go sleep. When I'm done. Elena. When I'm done, she said. Not defiant, just final. He stopped in the doorway. Can I ask you something? He said. Off the record. She looked at him. The kid, he said, in the cafeteria, Garvey. The first time, right after what Mercer did, before any of this. You asked me to check on him. He paused. You'd just been shoved in front of 80 people. You were running on 38 hours without sleep, and the first thing you did when I walked up was, you were worried about a 19-year-old who dropped his lunch tray. She was quiet. Why? He said. She looked at the notebook. Because he was embarrassed, she said. And embarrassed is a small thing that can feel very large when you're 19 and you've just dropped your tray in front of a room full of people and nobody says anything to you about it. She paused. Someone should have said something. Hale looked at her. How do you hold both of those things? He said. The technical work and that, the 19-year-old with the tray. She picked up the notebook. The same way anyone holds anything, she said. You just don't let go of either one. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then he said, Good night, Chief Voss. General? He left. The door closed. The room was quiet. The display showed nothing. The clock on the wall read 22:38. She opened the notebook and wrote for 12 more minutes. Then she closed it. She sat for a moment in the specific silence of a room where the work was finally, genuinely finished. Not the silence of waiting, not the silence of held breath, but the silence of something completed. A machine at rest, a problem solved. She stood. She picked up the notebook and her pen and her jacket, which had been draped over the chair beside her for the last 2 hours, and was still the same faded gray it had always been, worn and functional and entirely without announcement. She walked to the door. In the corridor, the fluorescent lights were at half power, the nighttime setting, automatic since 2200. They made the hallway look different than it did in the day, softer at the edges. A little more honest, maybe, the way things look when the performance lighting goes down and what's left is just the actual space. She walked toward the stairwell. On the second-floor landing, she stopped. Below her, through the fire door's small window, she could see the first-floor corridor. One light on, near the far end. And in that light, Specialist Pack, at a folding table he'd set up outside the secure evidence room, running the transfer process on a certified medium with the patient, methodical attention of someone who had decided that doing this correctly was the exact and total shape of his obligation tonight. She watched him for a moment. He didn't know she was there. He was doing the work. She went up the stairs. In the security operations room, the terminal she'd used for the last 6 hours was still showing the final verification log. The last thing she'd looked at before the debrief. The screen that confirmed the payload corruption had held. The screen that said, in the flat, unambiguous language of technical records, that the thing she'd set out to do had been done. She logged out of the terminal. She turned off the monitor. She walked to the window. Fort Caldwell outside was dark in the way military bases are dark at night. Not completely, never completely, always some light from the operations buildings and the perimeter and the vehicles on the maintenance road. But the daytime density of activity had resolved into its nighttime skeleton. A base at rest, carrying its own weight, continuing its own purposes, unaware, as it had been for 14 months, of how much had been at stake inside its walls. She looked at it for a long time. 14 months. She thought about what had been in that channel, all of it. The operational schedules, the communication logs, the personnel movements, what someone with that data could know, what they could plan around. The specific, patient, catastrophic value of information gathered slowly and over time, each piece small, the whole of it enormous. She thought about the fact that she had found it in 40 minutes of looking at archived access logs in a security operations room while eating. She checked her memory. Exactly one dinner roll, a cup of coffee, and some eggs that morning. She thought about the 19-year-old private who had dropped his tray. She thought about the way Pac had asked whether she'd be back tomorrow, and the way the question had sat with her longer than she'd expected. She wasn't sure if she'd be back tomorrow. There was a situation in a different sector, still developing, that her handler at the oversight office had flagged 3 days ago with a note that said, "Assessment requested when available." The language of the note, when available, was the diplomatic version of now, and 3 days of not being available had passed. She would be redirected. Probably tomorrow. Probably before the courier arrived for the documentation, which meant Osterfeld would handle the transfer, which was fine. Osterfeld was careful. The work here was done. Something else was not done somewhere else. That was the permanent condition of the job. The horizon never resolved. You closed one thing, and the next one was visible from the closing. You slept between them, if you were disciplined about it, and ate when you remembered, and occasionally allowed yourself to stand at a window in a quiet military installation at 2300 hours and register that the thing you did today was real. She registered it. Then she stepped back from the window. In the parking lot below, a single light was on in one of the support vehicles. The duty driver, waiting for whatever shift change came next, probably reading something on his phone, probably cold, probably wishing the heater was better. She couldn't see his face. She hoped someone had brought him coffee. She turned from the window and went to find a room to sleep in. The corridor accepted her without announcement, as corridors do. And somewhere in the base records, in the access logs and the duty rosters, and the administrative files that the next 14 months would not treat with the care they deserved, a small entry was made. Chief Specialist E. Voss, guest access, Building 7 through 22, checked out. And then she was just a woman walking down a hallway, in a gray jacket, in the dark, going somewhere she needed to go. She slept for 5 hours and 20 minutes, which was not enough, and was also more than she'd expected. The room Osterfeld had arranged was one of the installation's guest quarters. A small, rectangular space with a single bed, a desk bolted to the wall, a window that faced the east parking lot, and a heating unit that cycled on and off through the night with the inconsistent dedication of something that had been serviced too long ago. She had slept in worse places. She had slept in considerably worse places, including a communications relay station in a mountain range whose name she was not at liberty to share, and a cargo container in a port city that had smelled of diesel and salt and something she had decided not to identify. The guest room at Caldwell was fine. She woke at 4:31 without an alarm, which was how she always woke. A clean transition from sleep to full presence, no intermediate groggy state, her body having made a decision about sufficient rest and implemented it. She lay still for 30 seconds, running the status check that had become as automatic as breathing. What did she know? What had changed while she was unconscious? What needed to happen first? The documentation needed to happen first. She got up. The security operations room was empty at 0435, lit by the nighttime half-power fluorescence. The terminal still logged out from the previous night. She logged back in. The evidence partition was still intact. Pack had completed the transfer before she'd gone to sleep. She'd found his note on the desk when she came in, written on a piece of the same paper as the access log folders, in the neat mechanical print of someone who had learned to write legibly in environments where legibility was a professional courtesy. Transfer complete. Medium is in the secure lockbox. Combination 7412. I'll be in at 0700 if you need anything. Pack. She read it twice. Then she sat down and began the final documentation. The technical record she was completing was not a narrative. It was an architecture, layer by layer, each component described in the precise language of the field, each decision documented with its rationale and its alternatives, and the reasons the alternatives had been rejected. It was the kind of document that nobody outside a narrow specialist community would ever read, and that the narrow specialist community would read very carefully, because the narrow specialist community was the one that would be building defenses against the next version of this problem, and the next version of this problem would be built by someone who had studied this one. She wrote until 7:14. Then she printed the documentation, checked each page against the digital version, found 2 places where the print rendering had introduced a formatting error, corrected them, reprinted those pages, and assembled the complete record in the order that would make the most sense to the verification team. 49 pages. She set them in the evidence transfer folder. She looked at the folder for a moment. Then she picked up Pack's note and put it in her jacket pocket. Not for any particular reason, just because it seemed like something worth keeping for a little while. Pack arrived at 7:02, 3 minutes before his note had promised. He came through the door with 2 coffees, not from the mess hall, from somewhere that suggested he had gone out of his way, and stopped when he saw Elena already at the terminal. "You've been here since 4:30, she said. He looked at the printed documentation on the desk, at the evidence folder. "Is it done?" he said. "It's done." He set one of the coffees on the desk beside her without being asked. It was black, which was how she drank it, which he had observed without making a point of observing. "The courier is coming at 10, he said. "Osterfeld set it up last night, direct to NSA archive." "I know. I'll need you to witness the chain of custody transfer." "Yes, ma'am." She picked up the coffee, drank, set it down. "How long have you been at Caldwell?" she said. He blinked. It was the first personal question she had asked him in 3 days. 7 months, he said. "Before that?" "Basic. Then technical school at Langdon." He paused. "I requested this posting. The B-Wing infrastructure work. I wanted the exposure to the actual systems." He paused again. "Not exactly what I expected when I got here." "No," she said. "I don't imagine." He sat down at his terminal. Not because there was work to do, the work was done, but because sitting at the terminal was what this room meant, and standing in it without a task felt wrong. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You've been asking me things for 3 days, she said. "You don't need to announce it." "Fair." He looked at his screen. "Last night, when you were working on the payload substitution, and I suggested the structural layer thing, was that, would you have found that on your own?" She looked at the middle distance for a moment. "Probably," she said, "at minute 22 or 23. He did the math. "We had 8 minutes to spare. We had maybe 5. The encryption layer had a secondary verification trigger I hadn't fully mapped. If I'd found the structural approach at 22, it would have been tight." She picked up the coffee again. "The suggestion was useful." He absorbed this. "Useful," he repeated. Not disappointed, just parsing the specific weight of the word from someone who didn't use words carelessly. "You thought correctly under pressure with incomplete information," she said. "That's the whole job. Most people can do 1 or 2 of those 3 things." She looked at him. 3 is harder. Pack looked at his terminal. Something in his posture changed. Not dramatically, not the visible inflation of someone receiving a compliment, but a subtle internal reorganization, the kind that happens when something you weren't certain about becomes more certain. He didn't say anything, which was, she thought, exactly right. At 08:15, she went to the mess hall. She ate breakfast, eggs again, and toast this time, and a second coffee, and sat alone at the table near the back wall, notebook open. She was not writing operational notes. She was writing something else, in the same compressed personal code, something that was not for any record and not for any debrief, just the private accounting she kept for herself. What had happened, what it meant, what she thought about it. She wrote about the collection package, about the 14 months of information that had been sitting in the maintenance channel while the base went about its life, and about the specific kind of violation that represented. Not dramatic, not explosive, just patient and invisible and comprehensive. The worst kind. She wrote about Pac suggesting the structural layer at minute 14 and being right. She wrote briefly about the cafeteria, about Mercer's hands between her shoulder blades and the specific practiced response of a body that had been trained to manage that kind of contact and had done so without any input from the part of her mind that was standing in a lunch line thinking about bread rolls. She wrote about the 4 seconds after, when she had turned and looked at him, and what she had seen. Not a bad person, not a monster, not the cartoon of the bully that the story might have wanted him to be. Just a man who had built his life around a particular idea of what power looked like and had not yet been made to understand the costs of that idea. She wrote, "He said the unprepared thing in Crandall's office. That matters more than the cafeteria." Then she closed the notebook. She sat with her coffee for another 5 minutes, doing nothing, which was a discipline she had to actively practice because doing nothing did not come naturally to her. And she had learned, in the years since she had understood this about herself, that the practice was necessary. You could not run at full capacity indefinitely. The math didn't work. You had to give the machine a moment to idle, even if idling felt like a waste, even if the horizon was always full of the next thing, even if stopping for 5 minutes with a cup of coffee felt like a self-indulgence you hadn't earned. She had earned it. She sat for 5 minutes. General Hale found her there at 08:27. He came in with Osterfeld, as he usually did, and Osterfeld peeled off to deal with something near the service counter while Hale came to the back table and sat down across from her with a cup of coffee that he had clearly been carrying for a while and had not drunk much of. "Documentation is ready," she said. "Osterfeld told me." He sat back. "The courier will be here at 10. NSA has already been notified." "Good." He looked at her for a moment with the expression he sometimes had, the one that was not general officer to chief specialist, but something more like one veteran professional to another, the look of someone who has been doing hard work long enough to recognize it across a table. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. She waited. Last night, after the debrief, Drexler made his calls. To the Pentagon, to the Oversight Office, to the Deputy Director of NSA Cyber. He paused. He told them the full picture. Both events. The collection package. Your role in identifying and neutralizing it. "That's his job," she said. He also told them something he didn't have to tell them. Hale held his coffee cup. He told them that the standard response to the second event would have compromised the operation, that the decision to run the cover response rather than the standard protocol was the decision that made the outcome possible, and that that decision came from you. She was quiet. He didn't have to say that, Hale said. He could have reported the outcome without the decision architecture. Most people in his position would have. "He's more honest than he seems," she said. "He is," Hale nodded. "The deputy director has requested a formal commendation review, for the record." She looked at him. "I don't need a commendation," she said. "I know you don't need it. He's doing it anyway." Hale looked at her steadily. "Let him. It matters for the record. Not for you. For the work. For the documentation of what this kind of response looks like when it works, so that the next time something like this happens and someone is arguing for the standard protocol against someone arguing for the unconventional approach, there's a documented precedent." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. She didn't like it. She understood it. Those were two different things, and she was old enough to know that the difference between them was not sufficient justification for refusing. "Fine," she said. I'll tell him. Tell him the pack should be cited too. The structural layer substitution was his contribution. Hale looked at her. He's a 19-year-old specialist. He thought correctly under pressure with incomplete information, she said. That's the whole job. He should know someone noticed. Hale looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote something in the small notebook he kept in his breast pocket. Not an AIDS notebook, his own, the kind of personal record that 30 years of institutional life teaches you to keep. He put the notebook away. There's one more thing, he said. She waited. Mercer. She looked at him. He requested to speak with you, Hale said. Before you leave, he came to Osterfeld this morning at 0600. Osterfeld told him he'd pass the request. She looked at the table. He doesn't have a right to it, Hale said. I want to be clear about that. If you say no, that's the end of it. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about what she'd written in the notebook, about the unprepared thing in Crandall's office, about the specific texture of a man saying something honest after the scaffolding had come down. Where is he? She said. Mercer was in the common room adjacent to the B Company duty station, a room with a couch, a coffee table, a television that was off, and 3 windows that looked out at the training grounds. He was standing when she came in, which was not the posture of someone who had been sitting and stood up, but of someone who had not been able to bring themselves to sit down. He was in his modified duty uniform, the small, visible difference of someone on a restricted roster, no unit patch on the left shoulder, no leadership designation on the collar. It was not a dramatic difference, but it was visible to anyone who knew what to look for, which on a military base meant everyone. He looked like he had not slept well, which she suspected was accurate. She came in and stood near the door. Not because she was uncertain about being in the room, because she wanted the dynamic of the conversation to be clear. This was not a meeting between people with equivalent stakes in the outcome. He had asked for this. She had agreed to it. Those were the positions. Sergeant, she said. Chief Voss? He looked at her and then looked at a point slightly past her, which was what people did when they needed a moment to collect the words they had been preparing. I wanted to say, I said the necessary thing in the sergeant major's office, but there was more that I didn't say, and I'm not sure whether saying it now is appropriate, but I wanted to try. She said nothing. He took a breath. I've been thinking about what I don't know, he said. Not specifically about you, about the structure of it, the fact that there are people doing work at a scale I have no access to, in ways I don't understand, and the base keeps running, and I keep doing my roster and my PT, and I've been here 6 years, and I have not once thought about the shape of what I don't see. He stopped. I don't know how to fix that exactly. I don't know if there's a specific action that corrects it, but I wanted to tell you that the shape of what I don't see is something I'm going to think about, deliberately. Mama and Tite. She looked at him. He was not performing this. She was good at identifying performance. It was a professional skill, detecting the delta between what someone said and what their body was doing while they said it. There was no delta. He was just standing in a common room at 0800 with bad sleep behind his eyes, trying to say a true thing to someone he had wronged. Okay, she said. He nodded. A pause. I know that's not sufficient, he said. I know the apology in Crandall's office was the appropriate one, and this is something extra that you didn't ask for and probably don't need. He looked at her. I'm saying it because I need to say it. Not for you. For me. So I wanted to be honest about that. That, she thought, was the most honest thing he had said in 3 days. I know, she said. Yeah, he said. Another pause. Quieter than the last one. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. The cafeteria. When I shoved you. He seemed to have some difficulty with the word or with what came after it. You said the system is malfunctioning, and then you turned away. He looked at her. What did you mean? She considered this. You, she said. You were the system, the room, the way the room worked, the hierarchy you'd built in it, the way authority operated inside it. She paused. What you did didn't compute. It was a behavior the system shouldn't have been capable of producing. That's what it felt like. He absorbed this. So you weren't... It wasn't dismissal, he said. You weren't dismissing me. I was, she said, but not the way you understood it. I wasn't dismissing you because you were small. I was dismissing the behavior because it didn't belong in the category of things worth responding to. He looked at the floor. That's worse, he said. I know, she said. That's why I'm telling you. He looked up. Something in his face had resolved, not into peace, not into the satisfied conclusion of a man who had gotten the absolution he came for, into something more useful than that, the specific expression of someone who has been handed a clear picture of a problem and is deciding what to do with it. I'll be honest, he said. I still don't know what I'm going to do with the 90 days. Nobody does, she said. At the beginning. He almost smiled. She turned to go. Chief Voss? She stopped. The work you do, he said. The thing you were doing in this building while I was... He stopped. I know I don't know what it is. I know I don't have clearance, and I'm not going to have clearance. But I want you to know that I know it's real. I know it matters. And He paused. I'm sorry I didn't know that before. She looked at him. She thought about all the things she could say to that. The calibrated responses, the professional closures, the things that were true but not necessary. Take care of your people, she said. When you get them back, that's all. She walked out. At 09:47, the classified courier arrived. He was a staff sergeant from the Regional Security Transport Unit, traveling with a locked case and a second soldier who was his security partner. They were polite and efficient and entirely focused on the procedural requirements of the transfer, which was exactly what the situation required. Elena signed the chain of custody form. Pack witnessed it. Osterfeld verified the documentation seal. The courier signed. His partner verified the case number. The 49 pages went into the locked case. The locked case went into the courier's vehicle. The vehicle left Caldwell at 09:59. Elena watched it from the window of the B-wing corridor until it cleared the gate. Then she went to find Colonel Marsh. Marsh was in her office on the third floor of the administrative wing, the corner office, which she had occupied for 3 years, and which bore the marks of someone who worked in a space rather than performs in one. An actual plant on the windowsill, slightly underwatered. A family photograph on the desk, angled so it was visible to Marsh but not to visitors. A whiteboard with the week's command schedule written in red marker, 3 items already checked off. She was on the phone when Elena knocked. She held up one finger, the universal language of 1 minute, and finished the call in the brisk navigational way of someone ending a conversation they had been trying to end for several minutes. She put the phone down. Chief Voss, she said. Colonel? Elena came in but didn't sit, not because she was being formal, but because this was going to be a short conversation. I wanted to speak to you before I leave. Marsh looked at her. The transfer review, Elena said. The one Sayers is going to run, through your communications and your decision records for the last 14 months. Yes, Marsh said. Her voice was even. I want to tell you what I expect it to find, Elena said, because I think you should hear it from me before you hear it from the process. Marsh was very still. I expect it to find nothing, Elena said. The transfer you processed was standard, correctly documented, and handled in good faith. The person who submitted the transfer request had 14 months of practice at behaving normally inside institutional systems. That's what made them good at what they were doing. She paused. You didn't miss a red flag. There wasn't one. Marsh looked at her for a long moment. You can't know that, she said. Until the review. I've read the personnel file, Elena said. I've read the transfer documentation. I've looked at the behavioral indicators for the collection window and the transfer window. There is nothing in the available record that a reasonable commander would have acted on. She held Marsh's gaze. You are a reasonable commander. The review will confirm this. Marsh looked at the plant on the windowsill. Her jaw was tight. I keep going over it, she said, quietly. Not to Elena exactly. To the version of herself that had been going over it since last night. The request, the meeting, what he said, how he seemed. Whether there was something, there wasn't, Elena said. You don't know. Adrienne. She used the first name deliberately. This is what sophisticated operations look like. They are specifically designed to be invisible to the people responsible for seeing them. If you had caught it, it wouldn't have been a 14-month operation. It would have ended in week 1. She paused. The fact that you didn't catch it is not a reflection of your competence. It is the intended outcome of the adversary's planning. Marsh looked at her. Her eyes were dry, but the effort required to keep them that way was visible, if you knew what to look for. That's a rational argument, Marsh said. Yes. Rational arguments are not always sufficient. No, Elena said. They're not. She looked at her. But they're where you start. And then you do the review, and you do the next posting, and you do the work. That's what sufficient looks like. Not the feeling, the doing. Marsh was quiet for a moment. You're not what I expected, she said. Elena raised an eyebrow. When I knew you were coming, the briefing before you arrived, I expected someone. She seemed to search for the word honestly rather than diplomatically. More self-contained, someone who operated at a remove. I do operate at a remove, Elena said. Not from the people, Marsh said, from the systems, from the institutional layer. But the people. She looked at Elena. Garvey, she said, the kid who dropped his tray. You asked the general to check on him before you knew about any of this. She gestured at the building at the last 48 hours. Before the second event, before the collection package, while you were carrying 38 hours without sleep in a cafeteria incident and a completed crisis. Elena said nothing. That's not a remove, Marsh said. Elena looked at the whiteboard, at the checked items, at the week's worth of command work that kept 300 people operational and hadn't stopped being relevant because a collection package had been running in the maintenance channel. Get through the review, Elena said, and then do the next thing. She turned to go. Chief Voss. She stopped. Thank you, Marsh said, for what you said about the transfer. It's accurate, Elena said. Not a courtesy. She left. She was in the parking lot at 11:12, with a bag that was exactly as nondescript as everything else she carried, waiting for the transport that would take her to the regional airfield and then to whatever came next. The morning had cleared, not warm, but bright. The autumn light doing the thing it did when it came in at a low angle and made everything look more defined than it usually did. The concrete, the flagpoles, the vehicles in their lots, the building facades in their institutional colors. Caldwell in the morning, going about its business, unaware of how close the last 3 days had cut. Pack came out at 11:17. She saw him coming before he saw her. He came through the B-wing side door with his jacket not fully zipped, and the expression of someone who had made a decision to come outside and was slightly uncertain whether it was the right decision. He stopped when he saw her. He came over anyway. They stood side by side in the parking lot. You're leaving, he said. Yes. Different sector. Yes. He nodded. He was looking at the flagpole rather than at her, which was the body language of someone being honest in a way they weren't entirely comfortable with. I've been thinking, he said, about what you said. The legacy systems. The things overlooked longest. He paused. I went back into the archived logs last night. After the evidence transfer, I know that's probably outside my... What did you find? She said. He looked at her. Nothing. This time. He paused. But there are 17 legacy system components in the B-wing architecture that haven't been on an active review schedule in over 3 years. 17 points of potential exposure that nobody is looking at because they've been there so long they've become invisible. She looked at him. I wrote it up, he said. A preliminary assessment. I know it's not my role, and I know I'd need to route it through my unit supervisor for it to go anywhere. And my unit supervisor is... He stopped. Complicated, given the last 3 days. Give it to Osterfeld, she said. He blinked. Osterfeld? He'll route it correctly. Tell him I suggested it. She looked at him. And Pack, it is your role. That's exactly your role. Looking at the things nobody is looking at because they've been there too long. She held his gaze. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. He stood with that for a moment. Okay, he said. Okay. He zipped his jacket the rest of the way up. Do you have a contact in case I find something in the legacy systems that needs... Route it through Osterfeld, she said. He'll know how to reach me if it's the right kind of finding. He nodded. They stood in the parking lot. The transport was visible at the far end of the compound, making its way through the gate check. You know, Pax said after a moment. For a person who apparently doesn't want anyone to know she exists, you leave a pretty significant, he stopped, impression. She almost said something. Instead, she almost smiled. Pax saw it. He filed it away. The transport pulled up. She picked up her bag. Keep the coffee going, she said. Yes, ma'am. She got in the transport. The door closed. Pax stood in the parking lot and watched it move back toward the gate. And he stood there until it had cleared and was no longer visible, which was slightly longer than strictly necessary, but he was 19 years old and had spent 3 days in the most consequential work of his life alongside someone who had changed the shape of what he understood to be possible. And standing in a parking lot for an extra 30 seconds seemed like a reasonable response to that. 3 weeks later, Brock Mercer was 11 days into the 90-day review period, which was 20 days shorter than the number that had seemed endless when Crandall first said it, and was now beginning to feel like what it actually was. A fixed duration within which a specific kind of reckoning was either going to happen or not, and the outcome was not in the review's hands. It was in his. He had been assigned to administrative support during the review period, documentation processing, scheduling coordination, the foundational work of running a unit that the people who actually ran the unit treated as background noise. He was good at it, which was both useful and slightly uncomfortable. The discomfort being that he was 48 hours into realizing that the people who had been doing this work while he was focused on the leadership visible activities had been doing it well, and that he had not, in 6 years, sufficiently acknowledged this. He was working on that. He was also, on his own time, reading, not the books you read when you want to feel informed. The uncomfortable ones, about leadership failures, about organizational cultures that enabled arrogance, about the specific and well-documented pattern of high-performing institutions undermined by the men at their center who had confused the institution's function with their own authority. He read with a yellow highlighter and the slightly painful experience of recognizing himself in case studies he did not want to recognize himself in. This was not pleasant. He did it anyway. On the 11th day, Crandall stopped by the administrative office at the end of the duty day. Mercer was the only one still there. Crandall looked at the desk, at the open book, at the yellow highlighter. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You eat?" "Not yet." "Mess hall's still open?" Crandall picked up the book, looked at the cover, set it back down. "This isn't required reading." "I know," Mercer said. So I'm reading it anyway." Crandall looked at him. "Okay," he said. "Okay," Mercer said. Crandall turned to go, stopped. "She asked me," he said, without turning around, "before she left, if I thought you were going to be okay." Mercer went still. "What did you say?" he said. Crandall thought about it. "I said I didn't know yet," he said, "but that you'd said the unprepared thing, and that counted." He walked out. Mercer sat in the empty administrative office with the yellow highlighter in his hand and looked at the open page. He went back to reading. At Garrison Falk, the individual who had separated from Caldwell 14 months ago and transferred 8 months ago, and whose vehicle had been missing from the lot since the night of Condition 4, his name was Technical Specialist Warren Gould, was located 11 days after his disappearance at a transit point 3 states away by a counterintelligence unit operating under the authority of the same oversight chain that had received Elena's documentation. The arrest was not dramatic. Arrests that are the product of careful, thorough patient documentation rarely are. He was in a motel room with a laptop that had been wiped but not thoroughly enough, and a prepaid phone with a contact list that the CI team would spend the next 4 months working through. He did not resist. When the lead agent asked him, in the room, what had made him think he could operate inside a military installation for 14 months without being found, he said, "Because nobody looks at the maintenance channel." The agent wrote this down. He was wrong about one thing. He had been found. It had taken a person who looked at the things nobody was looking at, who went into the archived logs while everyone else was responding to what was visible, who found the footprint in the maintenance channel and traced it backward through 14 months of patient accumulation, and then sat in a room for the better part of 2 days and fixed it. He was wrong that nobody looked. He had been wrong, specifically, about the Phantom. Well, 6 months after Fort Caldwell, In a different building, in a different city, in a different operational situation that was not connected to the events at Caldwell, except in the way that all the work was connected, by the same thread of invisible, unglamorous, consequential effort that ran through the whole career. Elena Voss was at a terminal in a room that looked much like the room she was always in, doing work that looked much like the work she always did. The situation in the different sector had resolved 3 weeks after Caldwell. Not cleanly, resolutions were never clean, but definitively. Another collection, another documentation package, another courier, another classified archive entry in a system with no public index. Then another situation. Then another. This was the shape of the work. Not a single event. Not a culminating moment. A sustained, ongoing contribution to something too large to see from the inside, built from the accumulated weight of many individual problems solved, many maintenance channels found, many legacy systems that had been overlooked long enough to become dangerous and were now no longer dangerous. She did not think about Caldwell often. She thought about it the way she thought about most of the work. As a completed thing, a closed file, a problem that had been solved and documented and handed to the institutions that would carry it forward. She thought about Pack occasionally, about whether he had given the legacy systems assessment to Osterfeld. She suspected he had. She thought about Garvey, the 19-year-old who had dropped his tray. She hoped someone had told him the story of the woman in the gray jacket wasn't about her, was about the room, and the room's failure, and the room's eventual reckoning. She hoped someone had told him that dropping a tray was the smallest thing in that room and the fact that he had been the one embarrassed by the environment, rather than the one who created the environment, made him, by any honest accounting, the most dignified person there. She suspected nobody had told him this, because institutions were bad at this kind of telling. She made a note in her notebook to find a way to ensure he knew. The note joined other notes, things she intended to do, things she intended to check on, things that required the small, specific human attention that her work otherwise made easy to overlook. She had learned, years ago, that you had to keep the list, that the operational focus that made the technical work possible had a cost, and the cost was the tendency to see problems rather than people, and the list was how she paid the debt. The cursor blinked on the terminal. She went back to work. Outside the building, whatever building it was, in whatever city, the world continued its complicated life. People in rooms doing things that mattered and things that didn't. Institutions making decisions that would ripple outward in ways they couldn't trace. Invisible work happening in invisible places, the kind that didn't generate headlines or ceremonies or any of the visible markers by which the world usually understood significance. The kind that just held things together. She typed. The work moved forward. The loudest voice in the room is easy to hear. The hardest thing, the only thing that actually matters, is learning to listen for the ones that don't ask you to.